What if I told you that a nation existed for exactly 5 days before it vanished into another country, only to reappear 3 decades later as a functioning democracy that nobody would recognize? This isn't science fiction. This is the story of Somaliland, a place caught between the violence of colonial map-making and the rigid rules of modern international law. On a warm January day in 2025, Israel became the first nation to formally recognize Somaliland as an independent state. Diplomats around the world scrambled. News anchors stumbled over pronunciations. Twitter erupted. But here's what almost nobody mentioned. This wasn't really a new country being born. It was an old wound finally being acknowledged. The Horn of Africa has always been a crossroads. For thousands of years, merchants carried myrrh and frankincense from these highlands to Egyptian pharaohs and Roman emperors. Empires rose and fell here. Religions spread across these deserts. But then came the age of empires from faraway lands. Men in London and Rome, offices drawing lines across maps with rulers and red ink, creating borders that would haunt generations. 2 colonial powers carved up the Somali coast. Britain took the north, Italy took the south and east. They ruled differently. They built different systems. They created different experiences. And when they left, they assumed everything would simply blend together like watercolors on wet paper. It didn't. The story of Somaliland is the story of what happens when artificial divisions become real identities. It's about genocide that the world ignored. It's about a people who built a working democracy from the ashes of civil war while their southern neighbors descended into chaos. It's about 3 decades of being everything a country should be, except recognized as one. And now, with Israel's recognition, the question everyone is asking is simple but profound. Can colonial borders finally be redrawn? Should they? Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, we'll travel back through time to understand how we arrived at this extraordinary moment. We'll walk the ancient trade routes, stand in the rooms where maps were divided, and witness the violence that tore nations apart. This is a story about borders and blood, hope and history, about how the past never really stays buried. Close your eyes, take a deep breath. Let's begin our journey to the Horn of Africa, to a land shaped by winds from 3 seas and scarred by lines drawn in distant capitals. Let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you through the centuries, through empires and independence, through unity and separation, until you understand why a small diplomatic announcement in 2025 carries the weight of more than a century of history. The Horn of Africa juts into the Indian Ocean like a question mark, and perhaps that's fitting. Long before anyone called this place Somalia or Somaliland, long before colonial governors or modern presidents, this land belonged to nomads and merchants, to poets and traders who moved with the seasons and the monsoon winds. Picture a landscape painted in earth tones. Vast plateaus rise suddenly from coastal plains. Acacia trees dot the horizon, their branches twisted by constant wind. Camels move in long caravans, laden with precious cargo. The air smells of salt from the sea and dust from ancient paths worn smooth by countless footsteps over countless generations. This was a sophisticated world, though different from the stone cities of Europe. Knowledge here lived in oral poetry, in genealogies memorized back dozens of generations, in songs that carried news across hundreds of miles. A man could recite his ancestry back 20 generations without pause. A woman could compose verses that would be repeated in camps from the coast to the highlands. The wealth came from location. 3 seas meet near these shores: the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean. Merchants from Egypt, India, Persia, and Arabia all came here. They sought frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins that oozed from trees in the highlands. Ancient Egyptians used these precious substances to embalm their pharaohs. Roman emperors burned them in temples. The frankincense trade was so valuable that Romans called this coast the land of Punt, a place of legend and luxury. The people here weren't passive participants in trade. They were skilled negotiators, fierce protectors of their territories, and masters of survival in harsh environments. Clan systems provided order without kings. Elders gathered under acacia trees to settle disputes, their decisions respected because of wisdom earned over decades. Warriors defended grazing lands and water sources. Women managed households, raised children, and often composed the finest poetry. Islam arrived early here in the 7th century, brought by refugees fleeing persecution in Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad himself had told his followers to seek sanctuary in Abyssinia, just across the highlands. Muslim communities grew along the coast, building whitewashed mosques and establishing schools where children learned to recite the Quran in melodious voices that echoed through narrow streets. By medieval times, independent sultanates ruled different regions: the Sultanate of Ifat, the Adal Sultanate, the Adrian Empire. These were sophisticated states with armies, currencies, and diplomatic relations with powers across the Indian Ocean. They minted coins, they built stone cities, they sent embassies to Ming China and Ottoman Turkey. In the coastal city of Xyla, merchants from a dozen lands haggled in a dozen languages. Ships with triangular sails arrived carrying Chinese silk, Indian spices, and Persian carpets. They departed loaded with frankincense, myrrh, ostrich feathers, and ivory. The harbor buzzed with activity from dawn until the evening call to prayer silenced the marketplace. Inland, life followed different rhythms. Nomadic clans moved with their herds, seeking grass and water in an unforgiving landscape. They lived in portable homes called akels, dome-shaped structures covered in woven mats that could be packed on camels and moved in hours. Their wealth was measured in livestock. Their honor was measured in poetry and bravery. This was a world in balance. A world that had evolved over centuries to fit its environment perfectly. Clan elders resolved conflicts through customary law called zir. Droughts came and went, but communities survived through mutual aid and intimate knowledge of every water source across vast territories. Trade flourished, poetry flourished. Islam provided spiritual guidance, while traditional customs governed daily life. But far away, in the palaces and parliaments of Europe, powerful men were looking at maps. They saw coastlines they wanted to control. They saw trade routes they wanted to dominate. They saw lands they believed needed their civilization, their governance, their god. The age of exploration was giving way to the age of empire, and the Horn of Africa, with its strategic location and ancient wealth, would not escape their attention. The old world was about to collide with something it had never encountered before: industrialized conquest, backed by steam engines and repeating rifles, justified by racial theories and religious zeal. The people of these highlands and coasts didn't know it yet, but their world was about to be carved into pieces by men who had never felt this dust under their feet or heard these poems sung under desert stars. The medieval sultanates of the Somali coast existed in a golden age that history often forgets. While Europe emerged from its own medieval period, these African Islamic states were building stone cities, establishing legal codes, and connecting distant continents through sophisticated trade networks. The Adil Sultanate, centered in the city of Zila, became particularly powerful in the 15th and 16th centuries. Its rulers commanded armies that challenged the Christian Ethiopian Empire in the highlands. They controlled trade routes that stretched from the interior of Africa to the ports of Arabia and India. Gold coins minted in Adil have been found as far away as China, evidence of just how far their commercial reach extended. Imagine the Sultan's court in Zila. The ruler sat on cushions in a whitewashed room open to sea breezes. Advisors and merchants presented their cases. Scholars debated points of Islamic law. Poets recited verses praising the Sultan's justice and generosity. Outside, the city bustled with life. Blacksmiths hammered iron into tools and weapons. Weavers created intricate textiles. Children played in narrow streets between stone houses with carved wooden doors. The architecture reflected influences from across the Indian Ocean world. Buildings featured coral stone blocks cut from the sea. Intricately carved wooden doors showed Persian influences. Arched doorways and high ceilings kept interiors cool. Mosques rose with elegant minarets, from which the call to prayer floated 5 times daily over the city. But the Adil Sultanate was just one of several independent states. To the south, the Adrian Empire controlled the fertile river valleys of the Shabelle and Jubba. They built sophisticated irrigation systems, turning arid land into productive farms. They constructed fortresses and castles, some of which still stand as ruins today, silent witnesses to forgotten power. The Ajoran rulers were known for their water management expertise. They built wells deep into the earth, lined with stone to prevent collapse. They constructed cisterns to store rainwater during the brief wet seasons. They developed a system of aqueducts that channeled water to fields and cities. This hydraulic civilization allowed them to support a large population in a challenging environment. These sultanates weren't isolated kingdoms. They maintained diplomatic relations with each other and with powers across the seas. Ottoman Turkey considered them allies in the struggle against Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean. Arabian rulers exchanged ambassadors. Indian merchants established permanent communities in coastal cities, intermarrying with local families and creating new cultural blends. The Portuguese arrived in the early 16th century, their ships armed with cannons, seeking to control the spice trade. They attacked coastal cities, burning and looting, but the Somali sultanates fought back fiercely. In 1542, a Portuguese fleet attempted to capture Zila and was repelled with heavy losses. The Sultan's forces understood their coastline better than any foreign navy. One ruler stands out in this period, Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Guri, or the left-handed, in the 1520s and 1530s. He led the armies of Adil in a jihad against the Ethiopian Empire. His forces, equipped with Ottoman firearms, conquered vast territories. For over a decade, he threatened to completely overturn the Christian Ethiopian state. Only Portuguese intervention, providing Ethiopia with their own firearms and military advisors, turned the tide. The wars between Adil and Ethiopia devastated both states. Cities burned, populations fled, trade routes were disrupted. When Ahmad Guri died in battle in 1543, shot by a Portuguese musketeer, the Adil Sultanate began a slow decline. The balance of power in the Horn of Africa shifted, creating a vacuum that smaller sultanates and clan confederations filled. By the 18th century, the era of great sultanates had passed. Power fragmented into smaller units. Clan elders held more authority than distant sultans. The coastal cities continued trading, but their golden age had dimmed. The interior regions returned to pastoral nomadism, with clans controlling territories through customary agreements and occasional warfare. Yet even in this fragmented state, the Somali-speaking peoples maintained a strong sense of shared identity. They spoke the same language across vast distances. They shared the same religion. They traced their genealogies back to common ancestors, real or mythical. They recited the same poetry, competed in the same verbal arts, followed the same seasonal movements. This shared culture without political unity would become crucial later. It was the foundation upon which nationalist movements would build their dreams of a unified Somalia. But it was also the fault line that colonialism would exploit, creating divisions where common culture had once created connections. The Sultanate era left behind more than ruins and legends. It established Islam deeply in the region's identity. It created urban traditions that would persist. It connected the Horn of Africa to global trade networks that made it strategically valuable. And it showed that sophisticated African states could flourish without European intervention, a fact that colonial powers would consistently ignore or deny. As the 19th century dawned, the old sultanates were shadows of former glory. But a new power was approaching, one that would reshape everything with an efficiency and thoroughness that ancient empires could never have imagined. European colonialism, driven by industrial capitalism and racial ideology, was about to arrive with maps and guns. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to round the Cape of Good Hope, opening a sea route to the riches of Asia. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's ships appeared in the Indian Ocean, forever changing the ancient maritime trade networks. The Somali coast, positioned strategically along this new route, suddenly became important to distant European powers. The Portuguese wanted to control the spice trade between India and Europe. They wanted to spread Christianity. They wanted gold and glory. Their strategy was simple but brutal. Establish fortified trading posts along the African and Asian coasts. Destroy any Muslim or Hindu trading networks that competed with them, and extract maximum profit through monopoly control. When Portuguese ships first approached Somali ports like Xyla and Mogadishu in the early 1500s, they were met with suspicion and hostility. The local sultans and merchants understood that these newcomers threatened their prosperity. The Portuguese brought cannons that could reduce stone walls to rubble. They brought a religious zeal that considered Muslims as enemies. They brought a ruthlessness that shocked even societies familiar with warfare. The Portuguese attacked Mogadishu in 1499, bombarding the city and burning parts of it. They attempted to capture Xyla, but were driven back. They established temporary bases on some islands, but never achieved permanent control of the Somali coast. The local rulers proved too resilient, the environment too harsh, and the strategic value not quite high enough to justify massive investment. But the Portuguese intrusion marked a turning point. For the first time, Europeans had demonstrated they could project military power thousands of miles from home. They had shown that technological advantages in shipbuilding and cannon casting could overcome local numerical superiority. They had revealed their ambitions to control trade routes that had functioned independently for millennia. By the 1700s, Portuguese power had declined, replaced by the Dutch, French, and British as dominant European maritime powers. These nations fought each other for control of trade routes and colonies, turning the Indian Ocean into a battlefield. African and Asian coastal societies became pawns in European great power competitions. The British East India Company, a private corporation given royal charter to trade and govern, became particularly powerful. They controlled India, and they needed secure routes to ship goods back to Britain. The Red Sea and Gulf of Aden represented the shortest route from India to Europe through the Suez. Any port along the Somali coast could serve as a coaling station or naval base. The French established a colony at Obak in 1862 on the northern shore of the Gulf of Aden. They later moved their colonial capital to Djibouti, creating what would become French Somaliland. This gave France a strategic foothold near the entrance to the Red Sea. Britain watched with concern. If France controlled both sides of the strait, they could threaten British access to India. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 transformed the strategic importance of the entire region. Now, a ship could travel from Britain to India in weeks instead of months. The canal became the most important waterway in the world for European imperial powers. Controlling the approaches to the Suez became a vital strategic interest. Britain had already established a colony in Aden, on the Arabian side of the Gulf. In 1839, Aden served as a coaling station and naval base, protecting British shipping routes. But Aden needed food supplies, particularly meat. The Somali coast, just across the water, had nomadic herders with thousands of cattle, sheep, and goats. British colonial administrators in Aden began negotiating with Somali clan leaders to secure reliable meat supplies. Meanwhile, the interior of Africa remained largely unknown to Europeans. Maps showed vast blank spaces labeled unexplored. Rumors circulated about the source of the Nile, about kingdoms rich in gold, about strange animals and exotic peoples. European geographical societies offered prizes for explorers who could fill in these blanks. Explorers like Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke ventured into Somali territories in the 1850s, facing hostility and danger. Burton was wounded in a spear attack, but these expeditions provided information that would later prove valuable to colonial administrators. They mapped water sources, identified clan territories, and assessed the economic potential of different regions. The Industrial Revolution in Europe created an insatiable appetite for raw materials and markets. Africa represented both, a source of resources like cotton, rubber, minerals, and a potential market for European manufactured goods. Missionaries added moral justification, arguing that Africans needed to be saved from Islam or traditional religions and civilized through Christianity and European culture. By the 1880s, multiple European nations were eyeing African territories. Germany was emerging as a unified nation and wanted colonies to prove its great power status. Italy, also recently unified, sought colonies to rival the older imperial powers. Belgium's King Leopold was carving out a personal empire in the Congo. France and Britain continued expanding their existing African possessions. Tensions rose as different European nations claimed overlapping territories. Minor colonial disputes could escalate into wars between European powers. Something had to be done to regulate this scramble for Africa. The solution was remarkably cynical. A conference in Berlin where European leaders would simply divide up the entire African continent among themselves without consulting a single African leader or considering any African interest. The people of the Somali coast didn't yet know that men in European capitals were drawing lines on maps that would determine their futures. They didn't know that their land, their homes, their clan territories were being discussed in languages they didn't speak by people who had never visited their shores. The age of high colonialism was about to crash over the Horn of Africa like a tsunami, sweeping away the old order and replacing it with something alien and brutal. In November 1884, representatives from 14 European nations gathered in Berlin for a conference that would reshape Africa forever. The host was German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The attendees included diplomats from Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and others. Not a single African representative was invited. Not a single African voice was heard. The Berlin Conference established rules for how European powers would carve up Africa. The rules were simple. Any nation that occupied a territory and could effectively administer it could claim it as a colony. Natural boundaries like rivers could serve as borders. Interior territories would go to whichever power controlled the adjacent coast. Most importantly, European nations would respect each other's claims to avoid wars among themselves over African land. In conference rooms overlooking Berlin's winter streets, men smoked cigars and studied maps. Africa was spread before them like a puzzle to be solved. Rivers and mountains formed natural dividing lines. Straight lines, drawn with rulers, created borders where no natural boundaries existed. The ethnic territories of African peoples, their traditional lands, their cultural boundaries, none of this mattered. What mattered was creating clear, internationally recognized borders between European colonial possessions. The British delegation came with clear, strategic goals. They wanted to protect the route to India through the Suez Canal. They wanted to connect their colonies in Egypt with their possessions in South Africa through a north-south corridor of British-controlled territory. They wanted to prevent other European powers from threatening these interests. The French had their own vision, a west-east belt of colonies stretching from Senegal on the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. This would give France control over the Sahara and the Sahel, vast territories that could provide resources and prestige. Italy, the newest European nation, arrived late to the colonial scramble. The British and French had already claimed the most valuable territories. Italy looked toward East Africa, toward the Somali coast and the highlands of Ethiopia. Here they might carve out an empire that would restore Italian greatness. Echoing the glory of ancient Rome, Portugal claimed historical rights to vast territories in Angola and Mozambique based on centuries-old coastal trading posts. Belgium's King Leopold presented his personal colony in the Congo as a humanitarian enterprise, claiming he wanted to end the slave trade and bring civilization. This was perhaps the conference's greatest. Leopold's Congo would become one of history's most brutal colonial regimes. The Berlin Conference's General Act was signed in February 1885. Africa was now formally open for colonization under agreed-upon rules. The scramble accelerated. European nations rushed to sign treaties with African leaders, often through deception or coercion. They sent military expeditions to occupy territories before rivals could claim them. They drew borders that would last more than a century, long after colonialism ended. For the Somali territories, the Berlin Conference's decisions would prove particularly consequential. The coast was divided into spheres of influence. France secured the northern shore around Djibouti. Britain would claim the northwestern territories adjacent to their Aden colony. Italy would take the northeastern and southern coasts. Ethiopia, though never colonized, would expand into the western Somali-inhabited regions. These divisions made no cultural or geographic sense. Somali-speaking peoples who shared language, religion, and clan ties found themselves suddenly separated by colonial borders. Nomadic pastoralists who had moved freely across vast territories for centuries would now need permission from colonial authorities to follow their traditional routes. Ancient clan territories were split between different colonial administrations. The British were particularly concerned about the highlands of Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Empire, under Emperor Menelik II, was the only African power that successfully resisted European colonization. Britain, France, and Italy all negotiated with Ethiopia, trying to secure favorable borders and prevent the empire from blocking their own territorial ambitions. These negotiations would create borders that cut through Somali-inhabited regions, leaving many Somalis under Ethiopian rule. Italy began signing protection treaties with Somali sultans in the mid-1880s. In 1889, they established a colony at Mogadishu. They signed treaties with the Sultan of Hobyo and the Sultan of Majiratine, gradually extending their control over the southern and northeastern Somali coast. The Italian colonial administration called this territory Somalia Italiana, Britain. Meanwhile, focused on the northern territories, they needed to secure meat supplies for their Aden garrison. They wanted to prevent France from controlling both sides of the Gulf of Aden. In 1884 and 1886, British officials signed protection treaties with several clans in the northern Somali regions. These agreements acknowledged traditional clan leadership structures while placing foreign policy under British control. The Somali leaders who signed these treaties probably didn't fully understand what they meant. The translation of concepts like protectorate and sovereignty into Somali was imperfect. Many chiefs thought they were simply agreeing to trade relationships and mutual protection against other European powers. They didn't realize they were signing away their independence. By 1890, the division was complete. 3 colonial powers controlled the Somali coast: British Somaliland in the northwest, Italian Somaliland in the south and northeast, and French Somaliland around Djibouti. A fourth partition occurred as Ethiopia, in negotiations with European powers, claimed the Ogaden region and other western territories inhabited by Somali clans. The Somali people had been divided into 5 parts, a fact that would haunt the region's politics for more than a century. The dream of Somali unity, of bringing together all Somali-speaking peoples under one nation, would become a powerful political force, but it would clash repeatedly with the rigid principle that colonial borders, once drawn, were sacrosanct. The men in Berlin probably spent only hours discussing the Somali territories. They were a minor footnote in a much larger project of carving up an entire continent. But those hours of discussion, those lines drawn on maps, would shape the destinies of millions of people for generations to come. The colonial division of the Somali coast was complete. Now came the hard work of actually imposing colonial rule on a proud, independent people who had never been conquered. The British flag rose over the northern Somali territories on a hot day in 1884. For Britain, this wasn't about glory or civilization. It was pragmatic, almost reluctant colonialism. They needed meat for Aden. They needed to block French expansion. They needed to maintain control over the sea routes to India. The Somali territories fit these needs perfectly, and the British had no intention of investing more than absolutely necessary. British Somaliland, as it would be called, was always a poor colonial relation. The British invested little in infrastructure. They built few roads, schools, or hospitals. The colonial administration was small and underfunded. Unlike in Kenya or Rhodesia, the British didn't encourage European settler immigration. The climate was harsh, the land seemed unpromising, and the local population was difficult to control. The British system was indirect rule. This meant using existing local power structures to administer the territory rather than importing large numbers of British officials. Clan elders retained authority over their own communities. They applied customary law, collected some taxes, and maintained order. British district commissioners supervised but rarely interfered in local matters unless it affected colonial interests. Berbera became the colonial capital. This ancient port city had been a trading hub for centuries. Now it served as the main link between the Somali interior and British-ruled Aden across the Gulf. During certain months, when the monsoon winds were favorable, Berbera hosted a huge fair. Nomads came from hundreds of miles away to trade. Merchants from Arabia, India, and East Africa gathered. The British controlled this trade, taxing it and using it to supply Aden with livestock. The colonial administration consisted of a governor, several district commissioners, a small police force, and a few support staff. That was it. Thousands of square miles and hundreds of thousands of people were governed by perhaps a few dozen British officials. This wasn't enlightened restraint. It was simply that British Somaliland wasn't considered worth significant investment. Education was left mostly to Quranic schools and missionary efforts. The British built a handful of government schools in major towns, but these served tiny numbers of students. Most Somalis continued traditional education, boys learning clan history, poetry, and Quranic studies, girls learning household management and cultural traditions. Colonial education, where it existed, created a small elite that could speak English and work as translators or low-level administrators. Healthcare was almost non-existent. A few small clinics in coastal towns provided basic medical care. Inland traditional healers continued their practices. Diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and various parasitic infections remained common. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was low. The British kept statistics on trade and taxation, but showed little interest in the welfare of the Somali population. The economy remained pastoral. Nomadic clans moved with their livestock, following grass and water as they always had. The only real change was that now they paid taxes to the British, who licensed the export of livestock to Aden. Some small-scale agriculture developed near rivers and in highland areas. A bit of frankincense trade continued. But there was no industrial development, no modern infrastructure, no economic transformation. British rule did bring one significant change. Borders became real. Traditionally, Somali clans moved across vast territories following seasonal patterns. Now there were borders, with French Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, and Ethiopian-controlled regions. These borders were often arbitrary, cutting through traditional clan territories. Colonial authorities required permits for crossing. What had been fluid movement became controlled migration. The British established the Somaliland Camel Corps, a military force recruited from local clans. These troops, mounted on camels and trained in British military tactics, became the primary means of maintaining order. They patrolled the interior, collected taxes, and suppressed any resistance to British authority. Many Somalis joined for regular pay and prestige, though they were always commanded by British officers. Legal systems became dual and confusing. Serious crimes and matters involving British interests fell under British law, administered by colonial courts. Civil disputes and matters within Somali communities remained under customary law and Islamic law, handled by clan elders and cadis. This created jurisdictional confusion and opportunities for manipulation. The British were particularly concerned about other European powers. French Somaliland to the west was watched carefully. Any French expansion was protested. The border was surveyed and marked, though in the harsh interior this often meant just piles of stones placed at intervals. The Italians to the east were considered less threatening, at least initially. Relations with Ethiopia were complex, as the British tried to maintain good relations with Emperor Menelik, while also protecting what they considered their Somali protectorate. Despite the light touch of British administration, resentment grew among many Somalis. The taxes were burdensome. The restrictions on movement disrupted traditional life. The Christian colonial presence in a Muslim land troubled religious scholars. The clan elders who cooperated with the British were sometimes seen as collaborators, and stories circulated from other British colonies about harsh treatment, land theft, and racial discrimination. British Somaliland was never profitable. Year after year, the Colonial Office in London debated whether to simply abandon it. Only strategic concerns about the Red Sea and Aden kept the British flag flying. This reluctant colonialism meant less oppression than in some other colonies, but also less development. When independence finally came, British Somaliland would be left with almost nothing: minimal infrastructure, few educated citizens, no industrial base, and a population largely unchanged by colonial rule except for growing resentment of foreign domination. The British viewed their Somali subjects through racist colonial lenses. They were described as warlike, difficult, and primitive. Colonial reports noted Somali pride and independence with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The British never understood Somali culture deeply and made little effort to do so. They were here to serve British interests, nothing more. When Italy unified in 1861, it arrived late to the imperial feast. The great colonial prizes were already claimed. Britain and France had carved up most of Africa. Germany was expanding aggressively. The Netherlands controlled Indonesia. Spain held parts of Latin America and the Pacific. Portugal maintained its ancient colonies. Italy looked around and saw that the only territories left were the ones nobody else wanted yet. Italian nationalists dreamed of restoring Roman glory. They imagined a new empire across the Mediterranean, reclaiming territories once ruled from Rome. Africa, particularly East Africa, seemed the obvious target. The climate in parts of Ethiopia and Somalia wasn't too different from southern Italy. Surely Italian farmers could settle there. Surely Italy could extract resources and gain prestige. The Italian colonial project in Somalia began with a private company. In 1889, the Italian government granted a charter to the Benadar Company to administer the southern Somali coast. This was similar to how the British East India Company had operated in India. The company would govern, tax, and develop the territory, keeping any profits. If things went well, the Italian government would eventually take direct control. The Benedar Company was a disaster. They established their capital at Mogadishu, the ancient coastal city. They signed treaties with local sultans, promising protection in exchange for trading rights and political authority. But the company had no idea how to govern a vast territory inhabited by independent-minded nomadic clans. They were constantly in conflict with local leaders. They failed to generate profits. They couldn't maintain order. In 1905, the Italian government terminated the company's charter and established direct colonial rule. Italian Somaliland became an official colony under a governor appointed from Rome. Now Italian taxpayers would fund the colonial administration, and Rome would make the decisions. This marked the beginning of more aggressive Italian colonialism in the region. Unlike the British, Italy wanted settlers. The fascist government that came to power in 1922 under Benito Mussolini was particularly committed to settlement colonialism. Mussolini dreamed of a new Roman Empire. He wanted to send Italy's surplus population to African colonies, where they would farm, establish Italian communities, and spread Italian civilization. Somalia was designated as a settler colony. The Italian government offered incentives, free or cheap land, transportation subsidies, agricultural equipment, and tax breaks. Italian farmers, many from poor southern regions like Sicily and Calabria, signed up. They arrived in Somalia expecting paradise. They found a harsh environment completely different from Italy. The climate was extreme, water was scarce. The agricultural techniques that worked in Italy failed in Somali soil. Disease was rampant. The Italians established plantations along the rivers Juba and Shabelle. They grew cotton, bananas, and sugarcane. These plantations required enormous investments in irrigation. They also required labor, and the Italians forced local Somalis to work as laborers for low wages under harsh conditions. This created deep resentment. Somali pastoralists, who had never worked for anyone, who had lived independently for generations, now found themselves treated as servants in their own land. Italian colonial administration was more direct and intrusive than British rule. The Italians built roads, though mainly to serve their own commercial and military needs. They constructed government buildings, police stations, and administrative offices. They established an Italian legal system that superseded both customary Somali law and Islamic law. Italian became the official language. Clan leaders who resisted were removed or imprisoned. The Catholic Church accompanied Italian colonialism. Missionaries established churches, schools, and medical clinics. They attempted to convert Muslims to Christianity with almost no success. The presence of Christian missionaries in a deeply Islamic land added religious tension to existing political resentments. Education in Italian Somaliland was designed to create a subservient class. Schools taught basic Italian arithmetic and skills useful for serving the colonial administration. The message was clear: Somali culture was inferior, Italian culture was superior, and the role of educated Somalis was to facilitate Italian rule. A few Somalis were sent to Italy for higher education, returning with complex feelings about Italian culture and resentment of colonial subordination. Italian fascism brought even harsher policies. Mussolini sought glory through military conquest. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia from Italian Somaliland and Italian Eritrea. This was one of the last wars of colonial conquest in Africa. Italian forces used poison gas against Ethiopian troops and civilians. they committed atrocities that shocked even other colonial powers. After capturing Addis Ababa, Italy combined Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland into a single administrative unit called Italian East Africa. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia was brutal, but short-lived. World War II brought the British Empire into direct conflict with fascist Italy. In 1940 and 1941, British forces from Kenya and Sudan invaded Italian East Africa. The campaign was surprisingly successful. Italian colonial forces, despite being more numerous, collapsed quickly. By 1941, British forces had captured all of Italian East Africa, including Italian Somaliland. But the Italian colonial experience left deep marks. Italian architecture still stands in Mogadishu and other cities. Art Deco buildings, arched colonnades, wide boulevards. Italian vocabulary entered the Somali language. A generation of Somalis had been educated in Italian systems. Thousands had worked on Italian plantations or in Italian businesses. And the resentment of colonial oppression had created political consciousness. The Italian colonial period also created different experiences from British Somaliland. Italian rule was more intrusive, more transformative, and ultimately more traumatic. The attempt to create settler colonialism meant direct land theft. The aggressive assimilation policies attacked Somali identity more directly than British indirect rule. When independence came, these different colonial experiences would create different expectations, different political cultures, and different administrative systems in the North and South. Italy had wanted to be a great colonial power. They wanted to rival Britain and France. In Somalia, brutal exploitation and cultural violence that would complicate nation-building for decades to come. The dream of restoring Rome had become a nightmare for the colonized. 2 colonial flags flew over the Somali territories. The British Union Jack in the north, the Italian tricolor in the south. Same people, same language, same religion, same culture, but utterly different colonial experiences. These differences would shape everything that came after. In British Somaliland, life continued, much as it always had, just with a thin layer of colonial administration on top. Clans managed their own affairs. Elders settled disputes under acacia trees using customary law. Nomads moved with their herds across vast territories. The British stayed in coastal towns and administrative centers, rarely venturing deep into the interior. They collected taxes, regulated trade, and maintained nominal security, but otherwise left Somalis alone. British education was minimal. A few government schools in major towns taught basic English, mathematics, and clerical skills. But most education remained traditional, Quranic schools, where boys memorized verses and learned Islamic jurisprudence. Informal teaching, where elders passed down clan histories and poetry. The British made no serious effort to transform Somali culture or impose British values beyond what was necessary for efficient administration. In Italian Somaliland, colonialism penetrated much deeper. Italian officials established direct rule, replacing or supervising traditional clan structures. Italian became the language of government, business, and education. Schools taught Italian language and culture alongside basic subjects. The message was explicit: Italian civilization was superior, and Somalis needed to be uplifted through Italian influence. The Italian plantations created a new economic system. Instead of pastoralism and small-scale trade, Thousands of Somalis now worked as wage laborers on Italian-owned farms. They grew cash crops for export to Italy. They worked under Italian overseers, who often treated them harshly. This was a fundamental transformation of economic life, creating class divisions that hadn't existed before. Italian settlers lived in their own communities, separate from Somalis. In Mogadishu, Italian neighborhoods featured cafes, churches, and shops that could have been transplanted from Sicily. Italian families maintained Italian customs, spoke Italian at home, and educated their children in Italian schools. Racial segregation was formal policy. Intermarriage was discouraged. Somalis could work for Italians but couldn't be equals. The legal systems differed dramatically. British Somaliland maintained dual systems: British law for serious crimes and colonial matters, Somali customary law and Islamic law for most civil disputes. This allowed Somali culture to persist relatively unchanged. Italian Somaliland imposed Italian law across all matters, relegating customary and Islamic law to minor personal status issues. This was cultural colonialism, an attempt to remake Somali society in Italy's image. Infrastructure development followed different patterns. The British built minimal infrastructure: a few roads connecting major towns, basic port facilities at Berbera, telegraph lines for military communication. They saw no reason to invest heavily in a territory that barely broke even financially. Italian Somaliland received more investment, but it served Italian interests: roads to plantations, irrigation systems for Italian farms, government buildings demonstrating fascist grandeur. Healthcare revealed the colonial priorities starkly. British Somaliland had a handful of clinics providing basic care, mostly in towns. The British made no serious effort to improve public health across the territory. Italian Somaliland had more medical facilities, but they primarily served Italian settlers. Somalis could access these facilities, but often faced discrimination and were treated as second-class patients. Religious policies also differed. The British, ruling many Muslim territories across their empire, generally left Islamic practices alone. They understood that interfering with religion would create unnecessary resistance. Catholic missionaries in British Somaliland operated a few schools and clinics, but made few converts and were unactively supported by the colonial administration. In Italian Somaliland, the Catholic Church was more prominent. Fascist Italy saw Catholicism as part of Italian identity. Churches were built prominently in city centers. Missionaries received government support. While forced conversion wasn't policy, there was sustained effort to present Christianity positively and Islam negatively. This created religious tensions that rarely existed in British Somaliland. The political consciousness that emerged differed too. British Somaliland developed a small, educated elite who had attended British schools and worked in the colonial administration. They admired aspects of British parliamentary democracy. They wanted independence, but imagined it might look somewhat like British governance, with Somali leaders replacing British officials. Italian Somaliland's educated elite had more complex feelings. Many had been educated in Italy itself, seeing Italian society from inside. They experienced Italian racism firsthand. They were exposed to European political ideologies: socialism, nationalism, even fascism. They returned home with both admiration for Italian culture and burning resentment of colonial subordination. Their vision of independence was more radical, more transformative. The clan dynamics were affected differently, too. British indirect rule strengthened traditional clan structures by using them for governance. Clan elders retained authority and even gained some influence through their role as intermediaries with the British. In Italian Somaliland, direct rule undermined clan authority. Italian officials made decisions. Clan leaders who cooperated were rewarded. Those who resisted were replaced. This created new patronage networks based on Italian colonial favor rather than traditional legitimacy. By the 1940s, after decades under different colonial systems, British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland had diverged significantly. They shared culture, language, and kinship ties, but their experiences of colonialism had been fundamentally different. British Somalis had experienced light-touch exploitation. Italian Somalis had experienced intensive colonial transformation. These different experiences would create different expectations, different political cultures, and different administrative systems differences that would haunt the unified Somali state. Into this colonial order rode a man who would become legend. His birth name was Mohammed Abdullah Hassan. The British called him the Mad Mueller, a racist term meant to diminish him. His followers called him Sayed, a title of religious respect. For 20 years, from 1899 to 1920, he led the most sustained resistance to colonial rule in the entire Horn of Africa. Mohammed Abdullah Hassan was born around 1856 in the northern Somali territories. He came from a respected religious family. As a young man, he traveled widely, studying Islam in Sudan and making pilgrimage to Mecca. In Sudan, he was exposed to the Mahdist movement, which had successfully resisted British colonial expansion through Islamic revival and military organization. He returned home convinced that Somalis must resist the infidel colonizers. His message was both religious and political. He preached that Muslims had a duty to fight against Christian colonial rule. He criticized Somali clan leaders who cooperated with the British and Italians, calling them traitors to Islam and to their people. He attracted followers through powerful oratory and religious charisma. His poetry, composed in eloquent Somali verse, spread across the territories like fire in dry grass. In 1899, he declared jihad against the colonial powers. He gathered fighters from multiple clans, uniting them under religious banner rather than clan loyalty. This was revolutionary. Somali society was deeply divided along clan lines. The idea of clans setting aside their differences to unite against a common enemy under religious authority was unprecedented. The British were caught completely off guard. They had assumed their light colonial presence wouldn't provoke serious resistance. They had few troops in the region. They relied on the Somaliland Camel Corps, local troops commanded by British officers, to maintain order. These forces were designed to handle small-scale banditry or clan disputes, not a sustained religious insurgency. The Dervish movement, as Hassan's followers were called, employed guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to the terrain. They struck quickly at colonial outposts, seized weapons and supplies, then melted back into the vast interior. They knew every water source, every valley, every pass through the mountains. They moved faster than conventional military forces. They struck where the colonizers were weakest. Hassan established a fortified base at Talith in the interior. Here he built stone fortresses, established an administration, created a quasi-state. The dervishes minted their own coins. They maintained a standing army of several thousand fighters. They collected taxes from clans they controlled. They even had diplomatic contacts with other anti-colonial movements and with the Ottoman Empire. The British launched multiple expeditions against Hassan between 1901 and 1904. Each one failed. The Somali interior swallowed conventional military columns, supply lines stretched impossibly thin. Heat and disease killed more soldiers than combat. The dervishes would harass expeditions constantly, never offering decisive battle, wearing down the enemy through attrition. The Italians also fought the dervishes in their territory. A major battle occurred at Olole in 1904. The Italians suffered a devastating defeat, with hundreds killed and their commander mortally wounded. This humiliation shocked Rome. It proved that Ethiopian-style resistance to colonialism was possible in Somalia. Hassan's poetry was his greatest weapon. He composed verses mocking the colonizers, celebrating victories, mourning defeats, and calling Somalis to resistance. These poems were memorized and recited around campfires across the territories. They spread his message far beyond his actual military control. They created a shared anti-colonial consciousness. But Hassan also made enemies among Somalis. His religious purism alienated clans with different interpretations of Islam. His military campaigns damaged clans that refused to join him or actively opposed him. Some Somalis joined the British and Italian side, seeing Hassan as a destabilizing fanatic rather than a liberator. The resistance was never universally supported. The British tried negotiation. In 1905, they offered Hassan a treaty recognizing his control over certain interior regions in exchange for peace. Hassan accepted temporarily, using the peace to consolidate power. But the truce was fragile and broke down within a few years. Fighting resumed, as brutal as before. Clan leaders who supported the British were targeted. Hassan's forces raided their livestock, burned their settlements, killed those who wouldn't submit. This created a bitter internal conflict that overlaid the anti-colonial struggle. Somali society fractured between pro-dervish and anti-dervish factions, divisions that would persist for generations. World War I temporarily reduced British resources available for Somalia. Hassan's movement grew stronger during this period. He controlled significant territory and commanded thousands of fighters. The British worried that with Ottoman or German support, the dervish state might actually drive them out of the region entirely, but technology would prove decisive. In 1920, the British decided to end the dervish resistance once and for all. They deployed a new weapon, aircraft. Royal Air Force bombers flew from Aden to Somalia and bombed Hassan's fortresses at Talla. The dervishes had never encountered aerial bombardment. Their stone fortresses, impregnable to traditional attack, crumbled under bombs dropped from above. The bombing campaign shattered dervish military power. Hassan's forces scattered. His administration collapsed. He fled into the Ogaden region, still defiant but no longer able to wage effective war. In December 1920, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan died, probably from influenza. He was in his 60s, having spent the last 2 decades of his life fighting colonialism. The British and Italians celebrated their victory. They had finally defeated the Mad Mullah, who had humiliated them repeatedly. But Hassan's legacy endured. He had shown that Somalis could resist European powers. He had created poetry and legends that would inspire future generations. He had demonstrated that unity, even temporary unity, under religious leadership, could challenge colonial rule. Decades later, Hassan would be claimed by different groups. Religious conservatives saw him as an Islamic hero, nationalists as a freedom fighter, poets as a master of Somali verse. The complexity of his actual movement, its religious fundamentalism, its internal violence, its clan politics, was often simplified into a more heroic narrative. But the essential truth remained. He had fought colonialism when others collaborated, and he had never surrendered. World War II arrived in East Africa with shocking speed. In June 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and France. Suddenly, the quiet colonial backwater of the Somali territories became an active war zone. Italian East Africa, consisting of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, faced British colonies on all sides: Sudan to the west, Kenya to the south, British Somaliland to the north. The Italians struck first. In August 1940, Italian forces from Ethiopia invaded British Somaliland. The British garrison was tiny, just a few thousand troops against tens of thousands of Italians. The campaign lasted only 2 weeks. British forces evacuated through Berbera, boarding ships for Aden. Italy now controlled all Somali territories. For the first time in 50 years, the Somali coast was under single rule, albeit Italian rule. But Italy's triumph was brief. Britain was fighting for survival against Nazi Germany in Europe, but in Africa, Italy was vulnerable. British forces in Kenya and Sudan prepared for counterattack. They recruited thousands of East African troops. They brought in South African and Indian units. In early 1941, this massive force invaded Italian East Africa from multiple directions. The East African campaign was surprisingly one-sided. Italian colonial forces, despite numerical superiority, lacked equipment, morale, and supply lines. Many Italian officers had no real enthusiasm for Mussolini's war. Some Somali and Ethiopian troops in Italian service deserted or switched sides. The British advance moved faster than anyone expected. In March 1941, British forces captured Berbera, returning to British Somaliland after less than a year of Italian occupation. They pushed south into Italian Somaliland. Mogadishu fell in February 1941. By May 1941, all of Italian East Africa was under British occupation. Emperor Haile Selassie returned to Ethiopia in triumph. Italian colonialism in Africa was finished. The British now faced an unprecedented situation. They controlled all Somali territories. British Somaliland was theirs by colonial right. Italian Somaliland was conquered territory. The Ogaden region, traditionally Somali but part of Ethiopia, was under British military administration pending Haile Selassie's return to power. For the first time, someone could imagine a unified Somalia under single administration. Some British officials proposed exactly that. Ernest Bevin, British Foreign Secretary, suggested in 1946 creating a unified Somalia under British trusteeship. This would include British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, the Ogaden, and even French Somaliland, if the French agreed. It would prepare the unified territory for eventual independence as a single nation. Somali nationalists were ecstatic. Finally, someone with power was proposing what they had dreamed of: unity. The Somali Youth League, formed in 1943, campaigned vigorously for unification. They argued that all Somali-speaking peoples should form one nation. The colonial divisions were artificial and should be erased. Independence should mean all Somalis together, not fragmented into different states. But the proposal faced immediate opposition. Ethiopia strongly objected to losing the Ogaden. Haile Selassie argued that Ethiopia had never truly been colonized and deserved to reclaim all its traditional territories, including Somali-inhabited regions. France refused to consider giving up French Somaliland, which they saw as strategically vital for maintaining influence in the Red Sea region. The Soviet Union objected at the United Nations. Stalin saw British expansion in East Africa as threatening Soviet interests. The Cold War was beginning, and every colonial issue became a proxy for superpower competition. The Soviets blocked Bevan's proposal in the UN Security Council. Most surprisingly, many Italian politicians worked to reclaim their former colony. Italy had lost the war, but Italian businesses still had investments in Somalia. Italian Catholic missions maintained schools and hospitals. Italian settlers, though many had left, wanted to return. Italy lobbied the United Nations to return Italian Somaliland to Italian administration, arguing they had learned from past mistakes and would prepare it properly for independence. The British themselves were divided. Some officials saw merit in creating Greater Somalia. Others worried about the cost and complications. Britain was exhausted from the war, facing independence movements in India, struggling with debt. Did they really want to take on new colonial responsibilities? British Somaliland alone cost more to administer than it generated in revenue. Adding Italian Somaliland would multiply the burden. In 1948, the Ogaden question was settled against Somali interests. The British returned the Ogaden to Ethiopian control. Emperor Haile Selassie rewarded British cooperation with favorable trade agreements and political alignment during the Cold War. Somali clans in the Ogaden protested bitterly, but their voices carried no weight in international negotiations. The United Nations debated the fate of Italian Somaliland for years. Various proposals circulated: international trusteeship, British administration, immediate independence. Finally, in 1949, the UN reached a compromise. Italian Somaliland would become a UN trust territory administered by Italy. Italy would prepare it for independence over 10 years under UN supervision. By 1960, Italian Somaliland would become independent. This decision angered Somali nationalists. Italy, the colonial oppressor, was being rewarded with another decade of rule. The British Somaliland would remain under British control, following its own timeline to independence. The Ogaden was lost to Ethiopia. French Somaliland wasn't even discussed. Greater Somalia was dead before it could be born. But the 10 years of untrusteeship changed Italian Somaliland significantly. Italy, under international scrutiny, governed more benignly than before. They built schools, trained civil servants, established democratic institutions. A Somali legislature was created, giving Somalis experience in parliamentary procedures. Political parties formed and competed in elections. By 1960, Italian Somaliland had a functioning, if fragile, democratic system. British Somaliland, meanwhile, changed little. The British continued their minimal investment approach. Political development was slow. When the UN gave Italian Somaliland a firm 1960 independence date, British Somaliland began pressing for its own independence, hoping to achieve it simultaneously so both territories could immediately unite. The war years had shown that unified Somalia was possible. British military administration had governed all Somali territories without major problems. But international politics, Ethiopian opposition, Cold War dynamics, and frankly, racism, the assumption that Africans weren't ready for independence, had killed the opportunity. The colonial divisions would persist through independence and beyond. The wind of change was blowing across Africa. Ghana gained independence in 1957, becoming the first sub-Saharan African colony to break free from European rule. Its leader, Kwame Nkrumah, electrified the continent with speeches about African dignity and self-determination. Across the colonized world, people watched and hoped. If Ghana could be free, why not us? In the Somali territories, a new generation had come of age. These young men, and they were mostly men, as colonial education rarely included women, had attended colonial schools. Some had studied in Italy, Britain, or Egypt. They had read about the French Revolution, American independence, and Marxist theory. They returned home with a burning question: why should Somalis be ruled by foreigners? The Somali Youth League, formed in Mogadishu in 1943, became the primary nationalist organization. Its founding members were young intellectuals who worked in the Italian colonial administration. They met secretly at first, discussing politics and planning for independence. Their vision was clear: one Somalia for all Somalia-speaking peoples, regardless of clan divisions or colonial borders. The League's platform was radical for its time. They called for immediate independence, not gradual preparation. They demanded unity of all Somali territories, British, Italian, French, and those under Ethiopian control. They wanted democracy, with government based on popular sovereignty rather than clan hierarchies. They advocated for education, economic development, and ending clan conflicts that had weakened Somalis for centuries. But achieving unity across colonial borders proved immediately challenging. The Somali Youth League was strong in Italian Somaliland, but had limited presence in British Somaliland. Different colonial experiences had created different political cultures. British Somaliland had its own nationalist organizations with their own leaders and sometimes different priorities. In British Somaliland, the Somali National League emerged as the dominant political organization. Like the Somali Youth League in the South, they wanted independence, but they were more cautious about immediate unity with Italian Somaliland. Some British Somali leaders worried about being dominated by the more populous South. Others questioned whether administrative systems shaped by different colonial powers could easily merge. The clan issue complicated everything. Despite nationalist rhetoric about Somali unity transcending clan loyalties, clans remained the fundamental organizing principle of Somali society. Political parties, while claiming to be national movements, often drew support primarily from specific clans. The Somali Youth League was strongest among Darid and Hawai clans. Other parties represented other clan interests. Unity rhetoric existed alongside persistent clan competition. Education was creating a new elite that would lead independent Somalia. Colonial schools, limited as they were, had produced a class of Somalis who could navigate European institutions, speak European languages, and understand European political concepts. These educated Somalis dominated nationalist movements, creating some tension with traditional clan elders whose authority came from age and lineage rather than formal education. The role of women in independence movements was complex. Traditional Somali society was patriarchal, with clear gender roles. Colonial education had barely touched women, but some women, especially in urban areas, were becoming politically active. They organized within nationalist movements, though always in women's auxiliaries rather than mainstream party structures. They would later remember feeling that independence was fought by men, for men. The United Nations trusteeship over Italian Somaliland created unusual opportunities. UN officials monitored Italian administration, reporting on progress toward independence. Somali nationalists could appeal to the UN when they felt Italy wasn't moving fast enough. This international oversight made Italian Somaliland's path to independence clearer and more scheduled than British Somaliland's. Elections in Italian Somaliland during the 1950s were heated affairs. Multiple parties competed, often along clan lines, despite their national rhetoric. The Somali Youth League won most elections, but never overwhelmingly. Coalition governments formed and fell. This was democracy, messy and imperfect, but it was teaching Somalis how to compete for power through ballots rather than bullets. British Somaliland's political development was slower. The British saw no urgent need to prepare for independence. After all, the territory had little strategic value. Now that Aden was secure, it generated no profits. It demanded minimal British attention. Independence could wait. But as 1960 approached and Italian Somaliland's independence date was fixed, British Somalis grew impatient. Pan-Africanism influenced Somali nationalism significantly. Leaders traveled to Pan-African conferences, where they met nationalists from across the continent. They learned from others' independence struggles. They built solidarity networks. They absorbed ideas about African unity and decolonization that shaped their vision for Somalia. The question of borders became increasingly urgent. Would independent Somalia consist only of former British and Italian territories? Or would it press claims to the Ogaden, French Somaliland, and northeastern Kenya, where Somalis lived? The dream of Greater Somalia uniting all 5 Somali territories was powerful emotionally, but problematic diplomatically. Neither Ethiopia nor Kenya would willingly give up territory. France wasn't leaving Djibouti. How could unity be achieved? Some nationalist leaders advocated aggressive pursuit of Greater Somalia, even at the cost of war. Others counseled patience, suggesting that economic development and political stability should come first, with unity as a long-term goal. These debates would shape Somali foreign policy for decades. The Cold War added another layer of complexity. The Soviet Union and United States competed for influence in Africa. Somalia, with its strategic location near the Red Sea and oil-rich Middle East, attracted superpower attention. Nationalist leaders tried to play the superpowers against each other, seeking aid from both sides. This would work for a while, but eventually Somalia would have to choose sides. By the late 1950s, independence was inevitable. The question was no longer if, but when and how. Would British and Italian Somaliland become independent separately or together? Would they unite immediately or gradually? Who would lead the United Nation? These questions consumed Somali politics as the 1960s approached, bringing both excitement and anxiety about an uncertain future. In 1950, Italy returned to Somalia, not as conquerors this time, but as administrators of a UN trust territory. The arrangement was extraordinary. A former colonial power, recently defeated in war, was being given another decade to rule, but under strict international supervision and with a clear mission: prepare Italian Somaliland for independence by 1960. The Italian administrators who arrived in Mogadishu were different from their predecessors. Fascism had fallen. Italy was now a democracy, struggling to rebuild from war's devastation. The new colonial officials, at least in theory, were developmentalists rather than exploiters. Their job was to transfer power, not to maintain it indefinitely. The UN oversight made a real difference. United Nations officials monitored Italian administration, meeting with local leaders, investigating complaints, and reporting to New York. If Italy wanted to regain international respectability, it couldn't afford the brutal excesses of the fascist era. The Somalis now had an audience beyond their Italian administrators. Italy invested in education like never before. New schools opened across the territory. Teacher training colleges prepared Somali educators. Secondary schools expanded. A few hundred Somalis each year went to Italy for university education. The literacy rate, which had been perhaps 5% at the start of trusteeship, rose steadily. By 1960, Italian Somaliland had the educational infrastructure to staff a modern government. But this education came with complications. Instruction was in Italian. Students learned Italian history and literature alongside math and science. They sang Italian songs, studied Italian geography, absorbed Italian cultural assumptions. When independence came, these Italian-educated Somalis would lead a nation whose masses spoke little or no Italian, and whose culture was fundamentally different from Italy's. Administrative Somalization proceeded gradually. Lower-level positions in the colonial government were increasingly filled by Somalis. District officers were trained. Somali judges learned Italian legal procedures. Police forces recruited locally. By the mid-1950s, the colonial administration was majority Somali, though Italians still held all senior positions. A legislative council was established in 1950, evolving into a more powerful legislative assembly by 1956. At first, members were appointed by Italian authorities from among educated Somalis and clan leaders. Later, some members were elected. This gave Somalis experience in parliamentary procedures, debate, and legislation. Political parties competed for influence in the assembly, preparing for the democracy that independence would supposedly bring. The Somali Youth League dominated these early elections. Their nationalist credentials, established during the 1940s when they opposed Italy's return, gave them legitimacy. But they faced competition from parties representing specific clans or regions. Elections were never just about policy. They were about which clan would control resources and power. Economic development focused on agriculture. Italian technical advisors helped expand banana plantations in the south, along the Schabelle River. These plantations had existed during the fascist era, but now they were presented as development rather than exploitation. Somalis could own small plots. Cooperatives were encouraged. The banana industry would become Italian Somaliland's main export and source of foreign exchange. Infrastructure improved significantly. The Italians paved the main road from Mogadishu north to the Ethiopian border. They improved port facilities at Mogadishu and Kismayo. They built hospitals, government offices, and utilities. Much of this construction served Italian interests, but it left behind infrastructure that an independent state would need. Healthcare expanded, though unevenly. Hospitals were built in major towns. Mobile medical units visited interior regions. Vaccination campaigns targeted major diseases. Maternal and infant mortality began to decline, though they remained horrifically high by European standards. Traditional medicine still dominated in rural areas, as most Somalis lived beyond reach of modern healthcare. Women's rights were a contentious issue. Italian administrators and UN officials pushed for female education and political participation, seeing these as marks of modern civilization. Conservative Somali religious leaders and clan elders resisted, arguing that such changes violated Islamic law and Somali tradition. The result was compromise: a few girls' schools in cities, women's participation in politics through separate women's organizations, but no fundamental challenge to patriarchal structures. The unvisiting missions that came every few years provided important feedback. Their reports documented progress, but also identified problems. Corruption was growing, clan favoritism was evident, development was concentrated in Mogadishu while rural areas lagged. These reports pressured Italy to do better and gave Somali activists ammunition for their complaints. The 1956 elections were a turning point. The Somali Youth League won decisively, taking 43 of 60 seats in the Legislative Assembly. They formed a government with significant real power, though still under Italian oversight. Abdullahi Isa became the first Somali prime minister, leading a cabinet that was all Somali except for Italian advisors. Independence suddenly felt real, imminent. Preparations for independence accelerated. A constitution was drafted, debated, and revised. Would Somalia be a parliamentary system like Italy? A presidential system like the United States? How would clans be represented fairly? How would religious law interact with secular law? These questions consumed the political class. Training intensified for the civil service, judiciary, police, and military. Italy sent specialists to teach administration, finance, policing, and military tactics. Hundreds of Somalis attended specialized courses. The goal was to have a functioning state apparatus ready for Independence Day. But 10 years was barely enough time to build institutions that typically evolved over centuries. The relationship with neighboring Ethiopia remained tense. Many Somalis in Italian Somaliland had clan ties to the Ogaden region, now under Ethiopian control. The dream of Greater Somalia hadn't died just because the UN had returned the Ogaden to Ethiopia. Some politicians openly advocated for unification by force if necessary. This alarmed Ethiopia and complicated Somalia's international relations before independence even arrived. As 1960 approached, both excitement and anxiety grew. Italian Somaliland would become independent on July 1, 1960. But would it unite immediately with British Somaliland? Could these two territories, shaped by different colonial experiences, merge smoothly? Would the new nation survive, or would it collapse into the clan conflicts that had divided Somalis for centuries? These questions haunted everyone as Independence Day drew near. In British Somaliland, independence came suddenly, almost as an afterthought. While Italian Somaliland prepared methodically for July 1, 1960, the British colony was only beginning to consider what independence might mean. The British had invested little in preparing for transition. Political development was minimal. Administrative training was rushed. Nobody expected what happened next. The British government announced in 1959 that British Somaliland would become independent on June 26, 1960, just 5 days before Italian Somaliland. This timing was deliberate. The idea was that both territories would gain independence almost simultaneously, then immediately merge into a single Somali state. 5 days would provide just enough time to complete the legal formalities of independence before union. The decision reflected British pragmatism. They had no interest in maintaining British Somaliland long term. It was expensive, strategically less important now, and politically complicated. If the Somalis wanted unity, fine. Let them have independence and unite. Britain could wash its hands of the whole affair. But 5 days was an absurdly short time for a nation to exist. British Somaliland would gain independence on June 26th, be recognized as a sovereign state with its own government, flag, and constitution, and then voluntarily dissolve itself on July 1st to merge with Italian Somaliland. It was unprecedented. Nationalists were creating a state for the sole purpose of immediately ending it. The preparations were rushed. A constitution was drafted quickly, based largely on British constitutional models. Elections were held for a legislative council that would become the first parliament of independent British Somaliland. The Somali National League won a majority, and Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Igel became Prime Minister of the new state. On June 26, 1960, the British flag came down in Hargeisa for the last time. The new Somali flag rose in its place light blue with a white star, representing the 5 Somali territories. Celebrations filled the streets. After 75 years of British rule, British Somaliland was finally free. People danced, sang, and slaughtered goats for feasts. Independence had arrived, but the celebration had a strange quality. Everyone knew this independence was temporary. In 5 days, British Somaliland would cease to exist. The government formed on June 26th was already planning its own dissolution. Ministers were negotiating with their counterparts in Italian Somaliland about how to merge 2 different administrative systems. The 5-day nation accomplished little governing. There was barely time. Officials focused on the merger. What would the unified state be called? How would government positions be divided? Would the capital be in the north or south? These questions were discussed frantically as the clock ticked toward July 1st. International recognition of British Somaliland was confused. Some countries congratulated the new nation. Others waited, understanding that another change was coming in days. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser sent a telegram congratulating British Somaliland on independence, then sent another 5 days later congratulating the unified Somali Republic. The legal documents of this brief independence are remarkable historical artifacts. A constitution that took effect on June 26th and became null on July 1st. A parliament that was elected to govern British Somaliland but immediately agreed to dissolve itself. Government appointments made and then immediately renegotiated for the unified state. Everything was provisional, temporary, transitional. The Act of Union was signed hurriedly. It was a simple document stating that British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland would merge into the Somali Republic with effect from July 1st, 1960. But the legal details were vague. The Italian Somaliland Constitution would apply to the whole country, even though British Somaliland had its own constitution. Northern institutions would be dissolved and subsumed into southern structures. This would cause problems later. The Act of Union was never properly ratified by a referendum in British Somaliland. It was simply announced by the government and accepted. Some would later argue that this made the union illegal, that British Somaliland had never formally agreed to give up its sovereignty. These arguments would resurface 30 years later, when Somaliland declared independence again. The 5 days revealed important differences. British Somaliland politicians, used to British parliamentary procedures and English common law, found themselves in a strange position. Their territory had fewer people than Italian Somaliland. They had less infrastructure. They had no national currency. They had virtually no trained civil service. In a united Somalia, would they be junior partners? Would their voices matter? Some northern politicians had doubts even before union. They worried about being dominated by the more populous South. They questioned whether two territories with completely different administrative systems, legal traditions, and even languages of education could merge smoothly. But the pull of Somali nationalism was strong. Unity was the dream. Skeptics kept their doubts quiet. The British departure was almost perfunctory. After 75 years of ruling British Somaliland, the British left behind minimal infrastructure, a few trained officials, and a population that was perhaps 10% literate. There was no grand ceremony, no emotional goodbye. British officials simply packed up and departed, pleased to be rid of an unprofitable colonial burden. Those 5 days would be remembered differently by different people. For Somali nationalists, they were a minor formality on the path to unity. The real independence was July 1st, when a unified Somalia emerged. For future Somaliland independence advocates, those 5 days proved that Somaliland had been a recognized independent state that chose to unite with Somali and, therefore, could legally choose to separate again. On the evening of June 30th, 1960, as the clock ticked toward midnight, British Somaliland prepared to disappear. The flag would be lowered. The government would dissolve. The 5-day nation would become history. Tomorrow, a new nation would be born, the Somali Republic, uniting North and South in what everyone hoped would be a glorious future. Nobody suspected that this union, born in such hope and haste, contained the seeds of its own destruction. July 1st, 1960. In Mogadishu, the new capital of the newly united Somali Republic, thousands gathered for the celebration. The light blue flag with its white star flew over government buildings. Bands played. Poets recited verses about Somali unity. Politicians gave speeches about a bright future. After decades of colonial division, 2 of the 5 Somali territories had united. It was a beginning. The euphoria was genuine. For the first time in modern history, a significant portion of the Somali people were united under one government. The colonial borders that had divided families and clans were being erased. Italy and Britain were gone. Somalia would chart its own course. The possibilities seemed endless. But beneath the celebrations, enormous challenges lurked. 2 territories with utterly different administrative systems had just merged with minimal planning. British Somaliland used English common law and British administrative procedures. Italian Somaliland used Italian civil law and Italian-style bureaucracy. The North spoke English as its colonial language. The South spoke Italian. How would these systems merge? The answer, quickly apparent, was that they wouldn't merge smoothly. The Italian Somaliland Constitution became the constitution of the unified state, but it had never been submitted to British Somaliland for approval. Northern politicians found themselves in a parliament operating under rules they hadn't agreed to. Northern civil servants had to learn Italian legal codes overnight. The government positions were supposed to be shared fairly between North and South, but Southern Somalia had 60% of the population and had been preparing for independence longer. Key ministries went to Southern politicians. The Prime Minister was from the South. The President, largely a ceremonial position, was given to a Northerner as consolation. Northerners began to feel like junior partners in their own country. Clan politics immediately complicated everything. The Somali Youth League, dominant in the south, was primarily supported by Darid and Hawai clans. Northern clans, particularly the Isaaq, had less representation in the party. Other parties represented other clan interests. Parliament became a complex dance of clan alliances disguised in the language of national politics. The capital question symbolized tensions. Mogadishu, the former Italian Somaliland capital, became the capital of the unified state. This made geographic sense. It was the largest city with the most infrastructure. But it meant that northern politicians had to relocate hundreds of miles south, leaving their constituencies behind. Government became distant from northern Somalis. Economic integration proved equally challenging. The two territories used different currencies. Italian Somaliland used the Somalo, pegged to the Italian lira. British Somaliland used the East African shilling. Creating a unified currency required complex negotiations and caused temporary economic disruption. Merchants who traded across the former border faced confusion about exchange rates and payment systems. The legal system remained dualistic for years. Northern regions continued using common law for some matters because changing everything overnight was impossible. Southern regions used civil law. Lawyers trained in one system struggled in the other. Justice became inconsistent depending on where you were in the country. Education faced enormous challenges. Italian Somaliland had more schools and higher literacy, but instruction had been in Italian. British Somaliland had fewer schools, but those that existed used English. Should the unified state educate in Somali, Italian, English, or some combination? The debate consumed education policymakers for years. One bright spot was democracy. Somalia held democratic elections, unusual in post-independence Africa. Multiple parties competed. Power changed hands through ballots. The press operated with relative freedom. International observers praised Somalia as a model of African democracy. For a few years, it genuinely seemed possible that Somalia would succeed where other African nations failed. The military was integrated from forces inherited from the British and Italians. British-trained officers met Italian-trained officers. They spoke different languages and followed different procedures. Tensions emerged immediately. Who would command how? Would promotions work? Would clan background influence military careers? These questions would become explosive later. Foreign relations required careful balancing. Somalia wanted good relations with both Cold War superpowers. The Soviets offered military aid and supported anti-colonial rhetoric. The Americans offered economic aid and worried about Soviet influence in this strategic region. Somalia tried to play both sides, accepting aid from whoever offered it. But Greater Somalia remained the unfinished dream. 3 Somali territories were still outside the Union. French Somaliland, the Ogaden under Ethiopian control, and Kenya's northern frontier district. The new Somali government officially supported their incorporation, but how aggressively? Ethiopia and Kenya were independent nations now. France wasn't leaving Djibouti. Pursuing Greater Somalia could mean war. The government chose a middle path, official support for self-determination in these territories, quiet backing for Somali rebel movements, but avoiding direct military confrontation. This satisfied nobody. Hawks wanted aggressive action. Doves wanted to drop the territorial claims entirely. The compromise pleased neither side. Internal development proceeded slowly. Somalia was one of the poorest countries in the world. Infrastructure was minimal. Most people were illiterate. Healthcare barely existed beyond major cities. The economy relied on livestock exports and a bit of banana cultivation. Building a modern nation from this foundation would take decades of sustained effort and significant foreign aid. Corruption emerged quickly. Government officials, many coming from poverty, suddenly controlled resources. Clan loyalties meant that officials felt obligated to help clan members. Jobs went to relatives. Contracts went to friends. Development funds were diverted. This wasn't unique to Somalia nearly. All post-colonial nations faced similar challenges, but it hindered development and bred cynicism. By the mid-1960s, the initial euphoria had faded. Democracy still functioned, but it was messy. Clan competition dominated politics. Economic development lagged. Northern Somalia felt marginalized. The greater Somalia dream remained unfulfilled, but the nation was still trying, still hoping that unity would eventually produce the prosperity and power that nationalists had promised. The optimism hadn't completely died, not yet. The real crisis was still years away. The early years of the Somali Republic were a time of experimentation, hope, and growing frustration. Democracy, that imported concept from the colonizers, was being tested in an environment it wasn't designed for. Could clan-based society embrace multi-party democracy? Could a nation with 90% illiteracy sustain institutions that required educated, engaged citizens? Elections in 1964 showed both democracy's promise and its problems. Multiple parties competed vigorously. Campaigns were lively, with candidates traveling to remote areas, holding rallies, and debating policies. Voter turnout was high. People took democracy seriously. The Somali Youth League won again, but opposition parties gained seats. Power alternated through ballots, not bullets. This was remarkable for Africa in the 1960s, where many nations had already descended into dictatorship. But beneath the democratic facade, clan politics drove everything. Parties were essentially clan coalitions. When you voted, you weren't really choosing between policy platforms. You were voting for your clan's interests. Parliament became a venue for clan negotiation more than policy debate. Ministers directed development funds to their clan territories. Jobs went to clan members. The meritocracy that democracy supposedly created never materialized. Pan-Somali nationalism continued driving foreign policy. The government supported Somali rebel movements in Kenya's northern frontier district and in Ethiopia's Ogaden region. Radio Mogadishu broadcast programs encouraging Somalis under foreign rule to demand unification with Somalia. This alarmed and angered both Kenya and Ethiopia. In 1964, tensions exploded into violence. Somali rebels in Kenya's northern frontier district, armed and supported by Somalia, engaged Kenyan security forces. Kenya accused Somalia of aggression. The Organization of African Unity, a new Pan-African body, investigated. They sided with Kenya, reaffirming the principle that colonial borders were sacrosanct. This was a major diplomatic defeat for Somalia. The Shifta War, as this conflict was called, would drag on for years. It drained resources, damaged Somalia's international reputation, and achieved nothing. Kenya wasn't giving up territory. The OAU made clear that changing colonial borders, even to unite separated ethnic groups, was unacceptable. Pan-Somali nationalism crashed against the reality that other African nations feared border changes that might affect them too. Relations with Ethiopia were even more tense. The Ogaden region's Somali population chafed under Ethiopian rule. Rebel movements, supplied by Somalia, launched raids against Ethiopian forces. Emperor Haile Selassie responded with brutal counterinsurgency operations. Border skirmishes between Somali and Ethiopian forces occurred regularly. Both nations poured resources into their militaries rather than development. The economy struggled. Somalia exported livestock to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and bananas to Italy. That was about it. Droughts regularly devastated the pastoral economy. Famine threatened whenever rains failed. Foreign aid kept the government afloat, but it created dependency. Somalia needed Italian aid, Soviet aid, American aid, Arab aid, anyone willing to give. This vulnerability limited policy independence. Urbanization was creating new social dynamics. Mogadishu grew rapidly as people moved from rural areas seeking opportunities. Urban youth were less tied to clan identities than their parents. They consumed global culture through radio and cinema. They wanted jobs in the modern sector, not traditional pastoral life, but the economy couldn't absorb them. Unemployment among educated youth created a restless, frustrated demographic. Education expanded significantly. More schools opened. Literacy rates climbed slowly, but education created its own problems. Students learned in Italian, English, or Arabic, not Somali, which still had no standardized written form. Educated Somalis often felt culturally alienated, comfortable neither in traditional society nor in the modern world they glimpsed through education. The military grew in size and importance. Both superpowers offered military aid. The Soviets provided tanks, aircraft, and training. The Americans provided trucks, communications equipment, and training. Somalia was building one of the largest armies in sub-Saharan Africa relative to population. But why? The only conceivable wars were with Ethiopia or Kenya over the Somali territories. This militarization was preparing for conflict. Women's roles were slowly changing in urban areas. More girls attended school. Women worked in government offices, hospitals, and schools. A small women's rights movement emerged, advocating for political participation and legal equality. But in rural areas, which was still most of Somalia, life for women remained largely traditional. Gender inequality was profound and largely unchallenged. Poetry remained central to Somali culture and increasingly political. Poets were public intellectuals, using traditional forms to comment on modern politics. A good poem could sway public opinion. Politicians cultivated relationships with famous poets. Radio broadcast poetry programs that reached across the country. In a mostly illiterate society, oral poetry was how ideas spread. Corruption grew worse as politicians learned to exploit the system. Government contracts required kickbacks. Ministerial appointments were sold. Development aid was diverted. Clan networks facilitated corruption. Officials felt obligated to share wealth with clan members, and clan members expected it. Reformers who tried to fight corruption faced clan backlash and found themselves isolated. Northern Somalia's grievances deepened. Development funds disproportionately went south. Government positions were held mainly by Southerners. The promises of fair power sharing made at independence weren't being kept. Northern politicians complained but lacked the numbers to force change. Some began quietly questioning whether union had been a mistake. But Somalia also had achievements. Life expectancy was rising slowly. Infant mortality was declining. More children attended school. Roads and telecommunications were expanding. The government, despite its flaws, mostly functioned. Somalia was building institutions, however imperfect. There was still hope that problems could be solved within the democratic framework. The late 1960s brought political crisis. The 1969 elections were particularly corrupt, with widespread vote buying and fraud. The Somali Youth League won an absurd supermajority through blatant manipulation. Opposition parties cried foul. Public trust in democracy plummeted. The system that was supposed to give everyone a voice had become a mockery. On October 15, 1969, President Abdirshid Ali Shermarke was assassinated by a bodyguard. The nation was shocked. As politicians began maneuvering for the succession, a different group was making plans. Senior military officers, frustrated with corruption and chaos, met secretly. They had guns, they had organization, they had a plan. Democracy in Somalia was about to die, replaced by something very different. On October 21, 1969, 6 days after President Shermarke's assassination, the Somali army moved. At dawn, troops surrounded government buildings in Mogadishu. Tanks rolled into key intersections. Soldiers arrested politicians in their homes. There was no fighting. The coup was bloodless and efficient. By midday, the military controlled the country. A Supreme Revolutionary Council was announced, led by Major General Mohammed Siad Barre. He was not a well-known figure publicly, but within the military he commanded respect and loyalty. Barre addressed the nation on radio, his voice firm and assured. Democracy had failed, he declared. Corruption had poisoned the state. Clan politics had divided the nation. The military would save Somalia from itself. The coup was popular initially. Many Somalis were disgusted with the previous government's corruption. Democracy had promised much, but delivered little. Maybe a strong military government could force the changes that democracy couldn't achieve. Young people, especially, supported the coup, seeing it as revolutionary and modern. Barre immediately declared Somalia a socialist state. The Somali Democratic Republic, he called it. The ideology was scientific socialism, a blend of Marxism, African socialism, and Somali nationalism. Private property would be limited. The state would control major economic sectors. Tribalism would be abolished. Somali society would be remade according to revolutionary principles. Tribalism, in fact, became illegal. It was now forbidden to even mention clan names publicly. The old curse of Somali politics, clan divisions, would be eliminated by decree. Everyone was just Somali now. No clans, no divisions, just revolutionary solidarity. This was breathtakingly naive or cynically manipulative, depending on your interpretation. Clan identity was centuries old. You couldn't abolish it by declaring it illegal. But Barre was serious about changing Somalia. Literacy campaigns were launched, using Cuban methods adapted to Somalia. Thousands of students were sent into rural areas to teach nomads to read and write. For the first time, Somali was given a standardized written script using Latin letters. Books, newspapers, and government documents began appearing in written Somali. Women's rights advanced significantly under Barre's early rule. The regime promoted female education and political participation. Women were encouraged to work outside the home. Some traditional practices, like forced marriage, were officially banned. Islamic scholars who protested these changes were arrested. The The revolution would modernize Somalia, conservative tradition be damned. The economy was nationalized rapidly. Banks, insurance companies, major trading houses, all became state property. Private business was restricted to small retail operations. The state would plan economic development, allocating resources rationally rather than through chaotic markets. This was how the Soviet Union had industrialized, and Somalia would follow the same path. Soviet aid increased dramatically. The Soviets saw Somalia as a potential client state in a strategically important region. They provided military equipment, economic aid, and technical advisors. Soviet-style apartment blocks were built in Mogadishu. Somali students went to Moscow for university. Russian and Cuban advisors helped restructure the military. The personality cult began subtly but grew quickly. Portraits of Barre appeared everywhere. He was called victorious leader and father of the nation. His speeches were broadcast repeatedly. His sayings were printed in newspapers. Children learned to sing songs praising him. This cult borrowed heavily from Stalin and Mao, adapted to Somali context. Opposition was crushed ruthlessly. Political parties were banned. Dissenting voices disappeared. The National Security Service, modeled on the Soviet KGB, monitored everyone. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Speaking against the government could mean arrest, torture, or death. The early popularity of the coup faded as repression grew. The revolutionary rhetoric about abolishing tribalism was exposed as hypocrisy. Barre came from the Marahan clan, a sub-clan of the Dirid. He systematically promoted Marahan and allied clans to key positions while purging others. The slogan among Somalis became Mad Marahan, Ogaden, another Dirid subclan, and Dulbahanti, yet another Dirid subclan. These three related groups dominated the government. Northern Somalia found itself further marginalized. Barre's clan base was in the south. Northerners, particularly the Isaaq clan, had little representation in the new government. The promises of the revolution rang hollow when development funds still flowed south and government positions went to Mod clan members. The North had grievances under democracy. Now, under dictatorship, it had no voice at all. The economy stagnated despite Soviet aid. State-run enterprises were inefficient and corrupt. Central planning couldn't adapt to Somalia's pastoral reality. Droughts hit hard, and the government's response was slow. Food shortages became common. The black market flourished as people circumvented state controls. Revolutionary socialism wasn't producing the prosperity Barre promised. But Barre had one great ambition that overshadowed everything else: Greater Somalia. The dream that democracy had pursued cautiously, Barre would pursue aggressively. The Ogaden, that Somalian-habited region of Ethiopia, would be liberated. This would be his legacy, his historic achievement. He began preparing for war. The military buildup accelerated. Somalia's army grew to become one of the largest in Africa. Soviet tanks, artillery, and aircraft poured in. Pilots trained in the Soviet Union. Officers attended military academies in Moscow. By the mid-1970s, Somalia had a formidable military machine, but Ethiopia, Somalia's target, was also being armed by the Soviets. The stage was being set for a proxy war that would devastate both nations. Meanwhile, Ethiopia was descending into its own revolutionary chaos. In 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown by a Marxist military junta called the Derg. Ethiopia became communist, like Somalia. Both nations were Soviet clients. Both had revolutionary governments. but they hated each other, and both wanted the Ogaden. The Soviets found themselves in the awkward position of arming both sides of a potential war. Barre watched Ethiopia's revolutionary turmoil and saw opportunity. The Ethiopian military was purging itself. The country was unstable. The moment to strike was coming. He made speeches about liberating oppressed Somalis. He armed Ogaden rebels more openly. He moved troops toward the Ethiopian border. In Mogadishu, the revolutionary government was preparing for the war that would define Barre's rule and ultimately doom both his regime and any hope of Somali unity. In July 1977, Somali tanks rolled across the Ethiopian border. The Ogaden War had begun. Barre gambled everything on this invasion. If he won, he would unite most Somali inhabited territories under one flag. He would fulfill the dream that had driven Somali nationalism since independence. He would be a hero, the leader who finally achieved Greater Somalia. The war started well for Somalia. Ethiopian forces, weakened by revolutionary purges and internal conflict, retreated rapidly. Somali tanks advanced deep into the Ogaden. Within months, Somalia controlled 90% of the region. Victory seemed within reach. Mogadishu celebrated. Barre's popularity soared. The revolution was achieving what democracy never could. But Barre had miscalculated catastrophically. Ethiopia, despite being in revolutionary turmoil, was too important for the Soviet Union to abandon. Ethiopia had a larger population, more strategic value, and a revolutionary government the Soviets had invested in heavily. The Kremlin faced a choice: support Somalia or support Ethiopia. They chose Ethiopia. The Soviets cut off aid to Somalia and switched sides. Suddenly, Soviet military advisors in Mogadishu were packing up and flying to Addis Ababa. Soviet weapons stopped flowing to Somalia and started flowing to Ethiopia. Cuban troops, acting as Soviet proxies, arrived in Ethiopia by the thousands. The balance of power shifted almost overnight. Somalia desperately sought new allies. Barre approached the United States. Despite his socialist rhetoric, he was willing to switch sides in the Cold War if America would provide weapons. The Americans were tempted. Gaining a client state at Soviet expense was attractive, but they hesitated. Supporting Somali aggression against a sovereign nation was problematic. Their alliance with Kenya, which feared Somali territorial claims, complicated matters. By early 1978, the Ethiopian counteroffensive began. Backed by Soviet weapons, Cuban troops, and South Yemeni forces, Ethiopia pushed Somali forces back. The Somali military, though large, was no match for this international coalition. Retreat became rout. By March 1978, Ethiopian forces had pushed Somalia completely out of the Ogaden and threatened to cross into Somalia proper. Barre had no choice but to withdraw. He announced on March 9, 1978, that all Somalia regular forces were leaving the Ogaden. It was a humiliating defeat. The dream of Greater Somalia was dead. Thousands of Somali soldiers had died for nothing. The economy was in ruins from war spending. And now hundreds of thousands of Somali refugees fled the Ogaden ahead of Ethiopian revenge, crossing into Somalia and creating a humanitarian disaster. The refugee crisis overwhelmed Somalia. Estimates suggested 500,000 to 1.5 million refugees flooded across the border. They were Somalis fleeing Ethiopian retaliation, bringing nothing but stories of horror. Somalia, already one of the poorest nations, now had to feed and house a massive refugee population. Camps sprung up near the border, squalid and desperate places where disease and malnutrition killed thousands. International aid agencies descended on Somalia. The UN, the Red Cross, Western charities all rushed to help with the humanitarian catastrophe. The aid kept people alive, but it also created dependency and corruption. Food aid was often diverted by government officials and sold on black markets. Refugee camps became permanent settlements. The crisis would last for decades. The war's economic cost was staggering. Somalia had spent its limited resources on military equipment now destroyed or captured by Ethiopia. Agricultural production had been disrupted as men went to war. Livestock herds were depleted. The already fragile economy collapsed. Inflation soared. Shortages of basic goods became severe. The Somali shilling became nearly worthless. Barre's legitimacy was shattered. He had promised victory and delivered defeat. The military, which had been the regime's power base, was demoralized and angry. Officers blamed Barre for the disaster. Some whispered about coups. Barre responded with increased repression. The National Security Service expanded. Suspected dissidents were arrested. The regime became more paranoid and brutal. Somalia's foreign policy lay in ruins. The Soviets were now enemies. The Americans provided some aid but remained wary of full alliance. African nations, through the Organization of African Unity, had condemned the Ogaden invasion. Somalia was isolated diplomatically, dependent on Gulf Arab states for whatever aid it could get. The clan dynamics shifted dangerously. Barre's clan coalition, the Mod Group, had dominated the government and military, but the war's failure weakened Barre's position. Other clans saw opportunity. Political competition became more intense and more violent. Barre responded by favoring his own clan more blatantly, which further alienated others. The revolutionary rhetoric about abolishing tribalism was now completely dead. Northern Somalia's patience was exhausted. The Isaaq clan, dominant in the north, had never benefited much from union with the south. Now they had watched Barre drain resources into a failed war, while the north received nothing. Northern officers in the military were purged, suspected of insufficient loyalty. Development funds went to areas supporting Barre. Resentment turned to rage. In 1981, Northern Somali exiles in London founded the Somali National Movement, SNM. It was explicitly a northern organization, primarily Isaaq, dedicated to overthrowing Barre's regime. They established bases in Ethiopia, which was happy to support a movement that would destabilize Somalia. The SNM began launching raids into northern Somalia, attacking government installations and military units. Barre declared the SNM terrorists and responded with collective punishment. Isaaq civilians were targeted. Checkpoints harassed northerners. Economic restrictions were imposed on northern regions. The government armed non-Isaaq clans in the north to fight the Isaaq-dominated SNM. What had been political opposition was becoming ethnic conflict. The Ogaden War had started as an attempt to fulfill national dreams. It ended as the catalyst for national disintegration. Barre's regime would survive another decade, but only through increasingly brutal repression. The economy would never recover. Clan conflicts, supposedly abolished by the revolution, became more violent than ever. And northern Somalia, feeling betrayed and abused, was beginning its long journey toward separation. The war had broken something fundamental in the Somali state, and it would never be repaired. Throughout the 1980s, northern Somalia watched as the South consumed the nation's resources and attention. Mogadishu received development funds. Southern regions got infrastructure investment. The military, still large despite defeat, was garrisoned mainly in the south. Northern Somalia was treated as a rebellious periphery to be controlled, not a valued part of the nation. The economic disparity was stark. Berbera, the North's main port, should have been a major economic asset. Instead, Mogadishu dominated trade. Southern business interests controlled import licenses. Northern merchants faced bureaucratic obstacles that Southern competitors didn't. Even the livestock trade, historically controlled by Northern clans, was increasingly regulated to benefit Southern interests. Education and healthcare in the North lagged far behind. Schools were underfunded. Hospitals lacked equipment and medicine. The few Northern students who received government scholarships for university often had to study in Mogadishu, far from home, in an environment where they faced discrimination. Northern professionals who wanted to advance their careers had to move south and navigate a system rigged against them. The Isaaq clan's relationship with Barre's regime had never been good. Barre came from a southern clan, and his Mod coalition excluded Isaaq. Key government positions went to Marahan, Ogaden, and Delbahantial from Barre's clan family. The Isaaq, one of the largest and most economically important clans, were systematically marginalized. This wasn't just bad policy, it was existential threat. The Somali National Movement, formed in 1981, gave northern grievances an armed voice. The SNM wasn't initially separatist. They wanted to overthrow Barre and establish a more equitable government. Their vision was a democratic Somalia where all clans had fair representation. But as Barre's repression intensified, separatist sentiments grew within the movement. The SNM operated from bases in Ethiopia. This was deeply ironic. Somalia's arch-enemy was now hosting Somali rebels. But Ethiopia had its own logic. Supporting the SNM weakened Somalia, prevented any revival of territorial claims on the Ogaden, and gave Ethiopia leverage. For the SNM, the alliance was pragmatic necessity. They needed safe havens, training facilities, and weapons. Ethiopia provided all three. SNM raids into northern Somalia became more frequent and bolder through the mid-1980s. They attacked military garrisons, ambushed government convoys, and assassinated local officials. The Somali army responded with counterinsurgency operations that were essentially collective punishment against Isaaq civilians. Villages suspected of supporting the SNM were burned. Livestock were confiscated. Young men were arrested arbitrarily. Checkpoints proliferated across northern Somalia. Soldiers, almost all from southern clans, manned these checkpoints and used them to harass Isaaq civilians. Travelers were stopped, questioned, extorted. Women were assaulted. Property was confiscated. The checkpoints became symbols of oppression, everyday reminders that the North was occupied territory in its own country. Economic warfare accompanied military repression. The government restricted trade in northern regions. Import licenses were denied. Export permits were delayed. Banking regulations made it difficult for northern businesses to access credit. This economic strangulation drove more northerners into the informal economy or into support for the SNM. The clan militia system emerged in this period. Barre's government armed non-Isaaq clans in the north, particularly the Dulbahante and War Sangilitu, fight the Isaaq-dominated SNM. These militias received weapons, money, and immunity for crimes against Isaaq civilians. What had been political rebellion became interclan warfare. Old clan rivalries were weaponized by the state. Urban areas in the north developed their own opposition culture. In Hargeisa and Berbera, educated professionals, merchants, and intellectuals formed a clandestine network supporting the SNM. They raised money, provided intelligence, and sheltered SNM sympathizers. The government's security services infiltrated these networks, arrested members, and extracted confessions through torture. Trust evaporated as neighbors informed on neighbors. Poetry and music became vehicles for coded resistance. Poets composed verses that seemed innocuous but carried revolutionary messages understood by their intended audience. Musicians sang songs that lamented northern suffering in metaphors. The government banned certain poets and musicians, which only increased their popularity. Culture became politics. International human rights organizations began documenting abuses in northern Somalia. Reports emerged of extrajudicial killings, torture, arbitrary detention, and collective punishment. The Barre regime denied everything or claimed the victims were terrorists. Western governments, which provided Somalia with aid, issued quiet warnings but continued support. Cold War logic mattered more than human rights. By the late 1980s, northern Somalia was effectively a conflict zone. The SNM controlled rural areas at night. The government controlled towns during the day. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. The Somali army, demoralized since the Ogaden defeat, was poorly motivated and poorly led. Corruption was rampant. Officers sold weapons to rebels, pocketed soldiers' salaries, and avoided combat. The Isaaq diaspora spread across the Gulf states, East Africa, and the West. Mobilized to support the SNM, they raised funds, purchased weapons, and lobbied foreign governments. The diaspora became crucial to the movement's survival. Money sent home supported families affected by government repression and funded the armed resistance. Northern identity was hardening. People who had once seen themselves as Somali first, clan second, began to identify primarily as Northerners or as people from the former British Somaliland. The 30 years since Union hadn't created shared national identity. Instead, they had revealed that North and South were fundamentally different, products of different colonial experiences with different political cultures. Barre's response to growing Northern alienation was more repression, not reform. He couldn't conceive of accommodation or power sharing. His logic was military, crush rebellion with overwhelming force. But force was creating more rebels than it killed. Every village burned, every family dispossessed, every young man arrested without cause created new SNM sympathizers. The regime was creating its own opposition. By 1988, the situation was unsustainable. The SNM was stronger than ever. The North was seething with resentment. The government's repression was becoming genocidal in character. Something had to break. When it did, the violence would shock even those who had witnessed the previous decade's brutality. The worst was yet to come. In May 1988, the SNM made a fateful decision. Instead of continuing guerrilla warfare from Ethiopia, they would launch a major offensive to capture cities in northern Somalia. The goal was to hold urban centers, declare northern autonomy, and force international recognition of their cause. It was a gamble, a desperate escalation, but the SNM leadership felt they had no choice. On May 27, 1988, SNM fighters attacked Hargeisa and Buro simultaneously. They overran government positions quickly. Within days, they controlled most of both cities. The civilian population, after years of repression, largely welcomed them. It seemed like liberation, but Siad Barre's response would turn cities into graveyards. Barre ordered the military to retake the cities at any cost. He didn't care about civilian casualties. In fact, collective punishment against the Isaaq population was the point. If the Isaaq supported the SNM, then all Isaaq were enemies. Jets and artillery were deployed not against military targets, but against entire neighborhoods. The bombardment of Hargeisa began in late May and continued for weeks. Artillery fired into residential areas. Fighter jets dropped bombs on markets, mosques, and hospitals. Entire neighborhoods were leveled. The historic city, one of the oldest in Somalia, was systematically destroyed. Survivors called it the Dresden of Africa. Civilians fled in terror. Tens of thousands abandoned their homes, grabbing whatever they could carry, and ran. They fled into the countryside, into the mountains, across the border, into Ethiopia. Families were separated in the chaos. Children lost parents. The elderly, unable to flee, died in the ruins. The death toll began mounting into the thousands. Government forces that entered the cities conducted systematic massacres. Soldiers went house to house in Isaaq neighborhoods, killing men and boys of fighting age. Women were raped. Elderly people were shot. Bodies were left in the streets as warnings. Wells were poisoned. Livestock were killed. The objective was clear: make the north uninhabitable for the Isaaq. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of cities. Prisoners, many arrested arbitrarily, were executed and buried in these pits. Some estimates suggest as many as 50,000 to 200,000 people died between 1987 and 1989 in what came to be called the Isaaq genocide. The exact number will never be known. Record-keeping collapsed, and many victims simply disappeared. Refugees flooded into Ethiopia, which was itself struggling with famine and civil war. Camps sprung up in the harsh borderlands. International aid agencies struggled to provide food, water, and medical care. Disease spread through overcrowded camps. Traumatized survivors told stories of horror that shocked even experienced humanitarian workers. The international community responded with silence. The Cold War was ending, but Somalia remained strategically important. The United States, which provided significant military aid to Barre's regime, issued mild criticisms but continued support. European nations expressed concern but took no action. The United Nations was absent. The Isaaq were dying, and the world looked away. Within Somalia, information was tightly controlled. State media reported only that the government was fighting terrorists. Images of destroyed cities were censored. Journalists who tried to report the truth were arrested or expelled. Most southern Somalis had no idea of the scale of violence in the north. Those who knew often didn't care. It was clan warfare, northern problems, not their concern. The SNM, outgunned and unable to protect civilians, retreated to rural areas. They had captured cities, but couldn't hold them against artillery and air power. But the offensive had achieved something crucial. It exposed the regime's brutality. The Isaaq population, even those who had been ambivalent about the SNM, now overwhelmingly supported them. Barre had turned political opposition into genocidal ethnic conflict. Hargeisa, which had been Somalia's second-largest city and a cultural center, was 90% destroyed. Satellite imagery showed a moonscape of rubble. Historic buildings were gone. The economy was annihilated. Survivors, returning after fighting subsided, found ruins haunted by feral dogs and memories. Rebuilding seemed impossible. The trauma of these years would shape northern Somalia permanently. An entire generation had experienced or witnessed atrocities. Trust between North and South, already frayed, was completely destroyed. How could Northerners ever trust a government, any government, based in Mogadishu after this? The emotional foundation for unity was gone. The brutality also broke the Somali military's cohesion. Officers from northern clans defected, taking their units with them. Soldiers from other clans, appalled by what they were ordered to do, deserted. The army, once Somalia's most effective institution, fractured along clan lines. Barre's regime was literally destroying its own military. By 1989, Barre controlled only Mogadishu and parts of the south. Multiple armed movements, the SNM in the north, the USC United Somali Congress in the south, the SPM Somali Patriotic Movement in the south, were all fighting against the regime. Somalia was sliding toward complete state collapse. The violence in the north had demonstrated that Barre would murder his own citizens rather than share power. The Isaaq genocide, though lesser known than other atrocities of the era, was thoroughly documented. Human rights organizations collected testimony. Mass graves were photographed. Forensic evidence was gathered. Years later, international lawyers would call it genocide, the deliberate attempt to destroy an ethnic group. But in 1988, as it was happening, the world's silence gave Barre's regime permission to continue. For northern Somalis, the genocide was the final proof that union with the South was fatal. They had tried democracy, they were marginalized. They had tried to work within the system, they were repressed. They had tried armed resistance, they were nearly exterminated. The only option left was complete separation. If Somalia couldn't be reformed, it must be abandoned. The idea of Somaliland, independent again, began to seem not just desirable, but necessary for survival. By 1990, Siad Barre's regime was collapsing. The economy was in freefall. Multiple armed movements controlled different regions. The military had fragmented along clan lines. Government writ extended only to parts of Mogadishu and shrinking territory in the south. The socialist revolution had become a kleptocracy maintained only by violence. The United Somali Congress, USC, primarily drawn from the Hawaii clan, advanced on Mogadishu from central Somalia. They were well armed and motivated by decades of Barre's favoritism toward his own clan. By late 1990, they reached the capital's outskirts. Fighting in Mogadishu's streets began in November. The government's last bastion was under attack. Mogadishu descended into urban warfare. Artillery fire destroyed neighborhoods. Snipers killed civilians. Militias looted. Thousands died in the fighting. Tens of thousands fled the city, becoming refugees in their own country. The capital that had symbolized Somali unity was tearing itself apart. On January 26, 1991, Barre fled Mogadishu in a tank convoy. After 21 years of dictatorship, he simply ran. The USC entered the capital and declared victory. But victory over Barre wasn't victory over chaos. The opposition movements, united only in their hatred of Barre, immediately turned on each other. The real nightmare was just beginning. Somalia had no government now. The state infrastructure, weak even in the best times, collapsed completely. Police vanished, courts closed, public services ended. Armed clans and subclans fought for control of neighborhoods, resources, and symbolic power. Mogadishu became a patchwork of fiefdoms, controlled by competing warlords. The USC split into factions. Ali Mahdi Mohammed declared himself interim president. General Mohammed Farah Aidid, who had led USC military forces, rejected this and claimed leadership himself. Both were Hawaii, from different subclans. What should have been political negotiation became armed conflict. Mogadishu's Green Line divided the city between warring Hawaii factions. In the south, other movements competed for power. The Somali Patriotic Movement, SPM, primarily Ogaden, controlled areas near the Ethiopian border. The Somali Democratic Movement, SDM, representing the Rahunwin clan, controlled the region between the two rivers. Each movement had its own vision for Somalia's future, and none would compromise. Weapons were everywhere. Decades of superpower military aid meant Somalia was awash in guns, artillery, and even tanks. Every clan militia was heavily armed. Children carried AK-47s. Technical vehicles, pickup trucks mounted with anti-aircraft guns, became the symbol of Somalia's chaos. Anyone with guns and followers could become a warlord. Famine followed warfare. Farmers couldn't plant or harvest during fighting. Livestock herds were raided or killed. Trade collapsed. Food shortages became famine as aid agencies struggled to deliver food through war zones. Militias seized food aid to sell or to control populations. By 1992, hundreds of thousands were starving. International intervention came slowly and reluctantly. The United Nations, focused on Kuwait's liberation and Yugoslavia's disintegration, barely noticed Somalia. Only when television images of starving children reached Western audiences did pressure mount. In December 1992, the United States launched Operation Restore Hope, sending 28,000 troops to secure food aid delivery. The American intervention, well-intentioned, misunderstood Somalia's conflict fundamentally. They thought securing food aid was the mission. But Somalia's problem wasn't logistics, it was political. Warlords would never accept peace that diminished their power. The Americans tried to impose order without understanding the clan dynamics, historical grievances, and power competitions driving the conflict. The UN mission expanded into nation-building. They tried to mediate between factions, establish a transitional government, and restore basic services. But every proposal favored some clans and alienated others. The UN became another player in Somalia's civil war rather than a neutral peacemaker. Their presence didn't stop the conflict. It complicated it. The Battle of Mogadishu in October 1993 turned American opinion against intervention. U.S. forces attempted to capture General Aidid's senior lieutenants. The mission went wrong. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. Somali militias surrounded American forces. 18 Americans died in ferocious urban combat. Bodies of American soldiers were dragged through Mogadishu's streets. Images broadcast globally. America withdrew. The UN mission continued weakly, but effectively ended by 1995. International forces left Somalia to its fate. The intervention had failed. Somalia remained collapsed, but the outside world had learned a lesson. Somalia was a quagmire where good intentions turned into disasters. Nobody wanted to try again. Somalia fragmented further. Puntland, in the northeast, declared regional autonomy in 1998. They didn't claim independence, but established a functioning regional government. Southern regions became a jigsaw of competing authorities. Mogadishu remained divided. Various Islamic organizations tried to establish order based on Sharia law, creating yet another layer of competing power. Attempts at national reconciliation occurred repeatedly through the 1990s and 2000s. Conferences in Djibouti, Kenya, and elsewhere brought warlords and clan leaders together. They signed agreements, formed transitional governments, and pledged unity. Every agreement collapsed. Nobody would give up their weapons or power. The dream of reconstituting a Somali state seemed hopeless. Piracy emerged as an industry. Young men from coastal clans, unable to find legitimate work, turned to hijacking ships in the Gulf of Aden. International naval vessels were costly to patrol the vast waters. Pirates earned millions in ransom, which funded more piracy and enriched warlords. Somalia became synonymous with failed state chaos. But amid all this horror, one region followed a different path. Northern Somalia, the former British Somaliland, was building something unexpected. While the South tore itself apart, the North was quietly choosing peace, reconstruction, and ultimately independence. The North had learned that union with the South brought only death. Their experiment in rebuilding would challenge the assumption that Somalia could never be saved. On May 18, 1991, while Mogadishu burned and warlords carved up the South, something extraordinary happened in Hargeisa. Clan elders, SNM fighters, professionals, and community leaders gathered under the scorching sun. They met in the ruins of a city that Barre's regime had nearly erased. They came to make a decision about their future. For 4 days they debated. Should they join the fight for power in Mogadishu? Should they wait for a national reconciliation process? Or should they reclaim the independence that British Somaliland had held briefly in 1960? The discussion was long, emotional, and sometimes heated. But gradually, consensus emerged. The union with Somalia had been a catastrophe. It was time to leave. On May 18, 1991, the gathering declared the restoration of the sovereignty of the Republic of Somaliland. They weren't seceding from Somalia, they argued. They were reversing a voluntary union that had failed. British Somaliland had been independent for 5 days in 1960 before choosing to unite with Italian Somaliland. That choice, they now declared, had been a mistake that they were correcting. The declaration was remarkable for what it wasn't. There was no military coup, no strongman seizing power, no foreign intervention, just clan elders and community representatives deciding, through traditional consensus building, that independence was necessary for their survival. This was democracy, Somali-style slow, deliberate, and built on consultation rather than voting. Abdurrahman Ahmad Ali Tour, the SNM chairman, became the first president of the restored Somaliland. But his power was limited by design. The elders who declared independence didn't want another Siad Barre. They created a system where power was shared between the government, clan elders, and civil society. It was messy and sometimes inefficient, but it prevented dictatorship. The challenges were staggering. Hargeisa was 90% destroyed. Infrastructure was non-existent. The economy was shattered. Hundreds of thousands of refugees were returning from Ethiopia, needing homes that no longer existed. There was no money in the treasury, literally. The government had no international recognition, which meant no access to international aid or loans. But Somalilanders had something the South lacked: exhaustion with war. The Isaaq genocide had traumatized everyone. People desperately wanted peace, even if it meant making difficult compromises. The memory of Barre's brutality created shared determination that they would never experience that horror again. Peace wasn't just desired, it was existential necessity. Clan reconciliation became the foundation of Somaliland's reconstruction. The SNM was primarily Isaaq, but Somaliland's territory included other clans: Dalbahante, Warsangali, Isa, and others. Some had been armed by Barre to fight the Isaaq. Now they all had to live together. Traditional peacemaking processes, suppressed during Barre's regime, were revived. The Gerdi system proved crucial. Elders from all clans met regularly to mediate disputes, allocate resources, and build consensus. It was ancient conflict resolution, adapted to modern state building. When tensions rose between clans, elders intervened before violence erupted. When politicians disagreed, elders mediated. The Gerdi became Somaliland's secret weapon, traditional authority constraining modern power politics. Demobilization of SNM fighters happened peacefully. Thousands of young men had spent years fighting. They were armed and trained for violence. How do you persuade them to give up guns and return to civilian life? Somaliland used clan pressure, promises of integration into a new national army, and simple moral suasion. Remarkably, it worked. Most fighters disarmed voluntarily. Hargeisa was rebuilt slowly, painfully, mostly without international help. Diaspora Somalilanders sent money home. Local business people invested what little they had. Communities organized to clear rubble and rebuild mosques, schools, and markets. It was unspectacular, unglamorous work. No dramatic ribbon cuttings or grand announcements, just people refusing to give up. The economy operated informally. Without international recognition, Somaliland had no access to international banking, no ability to borrow, no foreign investment. Business happened through hawala, an informal money transfer system based on trust. Traders imported and exported through Berbera port. Livestock exports to Gulf states generated revenue. It was precarious but functional. Education and healthcare rebuilt from nothing. Teachers who had fled returned and taught in temporary structures. Nurses and doctors opened clinics with minimal equipment. The diaspora funded scholarships for students. NGOs, operating despite no official recognition, provided support. Progress was slow but steady. Somaliland held its first presidential election in 1993. It was imperfect. Security concerns limited participation in some areas, and the process was messy. But power transferred peacefully. Mohammed Hagi Ibrahim Egal, who had been British Somaliland's Prime Minister in 1960, became president. He brought experience and credibility. He also understood that Somaliland needed patience and pragmatism. The decision to seek international recognition was debated constantly. Some argued for immediate, aggressive lobbying. Others counseled patience, saying Somaliland should first build functioning institutions and then seek recognition from a position of strength. The government chose the middle path, claiming statehood while acknowledging that recognition would take time. The African Union, successor to the OAU, remained committed to the principle that colonial borders were sacrosanct. Somaliland's independence, they argued, would set a dangerous precedent. Every disgruntled region in Africa might claim the right to secede, the continent would fracture. Better to keep Somalia officially united, even if it had effectively ceased to exist as a functioning state. Western governments were sympathetic, but unwilling to act. They admired Somaliland's democratic progress and stability, but they wouldn't recognize it without African Union approval. The fear was that recognition would complicate efforts to restore Somalia, even though those efforts were clearly failing. Somaliland was trapped by others' hopes for a Somalia that no longer existed. Arab League states maintained relations with Somalia's transitional authorities, however weak. They wouldn't recognize Somaliland, though some provided quiet support. Turkey, increasingly influential in the region, maintained strict non-recognition while engaging economically. Somaliland was building a state that the world acknowledged existed but refused to officially recognize. Yet, Somaliland persisted. They issued passports, though few countries accepted them. They maintained a currency, though it had no official exchange rate. They conducted elections, though international observers came in personal capacities. They functioned as a state in every practical sense, while remaining legally non-existent. It was Kafkaesque, but it was working. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Somaliland built something that seemed impossible: a functioning democracy in the Horn of Africa. While the South remained in chaos, the North was holding elections, transferring power peacefully, and maintaining stability. It was imperfect. Corruption existed, clan politics persisted, poverty was widespread, but it worked. The Constitution, approved by referendum in 2001, established a hybrid system. A House of Representatives was elected by popular vote. A House of Elders represented clans through the Gurdi system. The president was directly elected. This mixed traditional and modern governance, creating checks and balances that prevented any single center of power from dominating. Elections became regular and competitive. In 2003, the presidential election was decided by just 80 votes, the closest election in African history. The loser accepted defeat peacefully. Power transferred smoothly. International observers, though they attended in unofficial capacities, were impressed. Here was democracy functioning in one of the world's poorest regions. Political parties were limited to 3 nationally registered parties to prevent clan-based fragmentation. Parties had to demonstrate support across all regions and clans. This forced coalition building and national rather than narrow clan appeals. It wasn't perfect. Clan identities influenced voting, but it prevented the complete clan-based fragmentation that had destroyed Somalia. The judiciary developed independence slowly. Courts applied a mixture of Somali customary law, Islamic law, and statutory law. Judges were trained in a system that had to reconcile sometimes contradictory legal traditions. Disputes over land, family matters, and business often went to traditional clan mediators rather than formal courts. The legal system was pluralistic, adapting to local realities. Women's political participation increased significantly. Somaliland reserved seats for women in the House of Elders. Women's organizations became politically active. Female candidates ran for office. Traditional restrictions on women's public roles loosened, especially in urban areas. Progress was uneven. Rural areas remained conservative, but the trajectory was toward greater equality. Education expanded dramatically. Schools were built in every district. Primary education enrollment increased. Secondary schools opened. Universities were established in Hargeisa, Berbera, and other cities. The diaspora funded scholarships. Quality remained a challenge. Teacher training was limited. Facilities were basic, but a generation was being educated. Healthcare improved from the catastrophic baseline of the early 1990s. Hospitals functioned in major cities. Clinics served rural areas. Maternal and infant mortality declined, though they remained high by global standards. NGOs provided support, working around the lack of official recognition. Preventable diseases were still major killers, but the trend was positive. The economy grew slowly. Livestock exports to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf remained the primary source of foreign exchange. Remittances from the diaspora provided crucial income for families and funded small businesses. Berbera port operated efficiently, generating customs revenue. Telecommunications companies provided cell phone service across the country, often better than in recognized nations. But lack of recognition created constant obstacles. Somaliland couldn't access international development loans. It couldn't sign treaties. Its passports weren't widely accepted. Airlines had to treat flights to Hargeisa as domestic flights into Somalia, creating insurance complications. Banks couldn't participate in international systems. Every international transaction required complicated workarounds. The informal economy dominated. Without access to international banking, business operated through hawala and cash. This made large-scale investment difficult, but also created flexibility and innovation. Somaliland businesspeople became experts at navigating informal systems, building trust networks that substituted for formal institutions. Relations with Somalia remained complicated. Officially, Somalia's transitional governments claimed sovereignty over Somaliland. Practically, they had no presence there. Somaliland representatives met occasionally with Somalia officials, but negotiations went nowhere. Somalia wanted union. Somaliland wanted recognition. Neither would compromise. Puntland, the autonomous region in northeastern Somalia, disputed Somaliland's borders. The eastern regions of Sul and Sanag contained Delbahanti and Warsangili clans that had historical and familial ties to both territories. Puntland claimed these regions based on clan geography. Somaliland claimed them based on colonial borders. The dispute occasionally turned violent but never escalated into full war. Piracy in the Gulf of Aden affected Somaliland negatively, though piracy was concentrated in Puntland and southern Somalia. International perception often lumped all Somali territories together. Somaliland had to work hard to demonstrate it wasn't a pirate haven. International naval forces gradually recognized Somaliland's difference, but stereotypes persisted. Terrorism concerns grew in the 2000s. Al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda affiliate, controlled parts of southern Somalia. Somaliland maintained strict security to prevent their infiltration. A few attacks occurred, killing dozens, but Somaliland's security forces generally kept the territory stable. This stability became an argument for recognition. Somaliland was a bulwark against terrorism. Diplomatic efforts for recognition continued without success. Somaliland maintained representative offices in Ethiopia, Kenya, the UK, and elsewhere, though they couldn't be called embassies. Foreign countries sent representatives to Hargeisa, though they couldn't be called ambassadors. It was diplomatic recognition without the recognition, everyone acknowledging reality while maintaining legal fiction. The African Union sent a fact-finding mission in 2005. Their report acknowledged Somaliland's unique history, its stability, and its democratic progress. It suggested recognition might be justified given that Somaliland was reversing a voluntary union, not seceding. But the AU never formally considered the recommendation. No member state wanted to open the Pandora's box of border changes. Some international legal scholars argued Somaliland had a strong case for recognition under international law. The 1960 independence, the voluntary nature of union, the complete state collapse in Somalia, and Somaliland's ability to meet statehood criteria supported recognition. But international law only matters when powerful states enforce it. And powerful states had other priorities. Somaliland's 30-year struggle for recognition became a test case for international principles. Should the sanctity of colonial borders always prevail? Does self-determination matter? Can a region unilaterally reverse a failed union? Should democratic governance and stability be rewarded? These questions remained theoretical debates while Somaliland continued existing, building institutions, holding elections, and waiting for a world that might never officially acknowledge it. The years stretched on. 1991 became 2000. 2000 became 2010. 2010 became 2020. For 3 full decades, Somaliland existed, functioned, and prospered relative to its circumstances, all while being legally invisible to the international state system. It was unprecedented. No other de facto state had maintained democratic governance and stability for so long without recognition. The international community's position on Somaliland became a case study in diplomatic contradiction. Everyone acknowledged privately that Somaliland was more functional than many recognized African states, but they wouldn't say so publicly. Recognition might work, they said. It might create a precedent that encourages secessionism across Africa. Better to maintain the fiction that Somalia was united. The African Union's stance was the primary obstacle. The AU's predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, had enshrined the principle that colonial borders were inviolable. This principle emerged from African leaders' fear that altering any border might trigger continental fragmentation. Every African nation had ethnic groups spanning borders. Every nation had regions that might prefer independence. But Somaliland argued they weren't violating this principle. British Somaliland's colonial borders were their borders. They weren't claiming territory beyond what Britain had administered. They were simply reversing a post-independence union that had failed catastrophically. Their case was unique, not a precedent for other secessionist movements. The argument didn't persuade. Eritrea's independence from Ethiopia in 1993, based on its distinct colonial history, had been accepted by the O. But that was in the context of defeating a despised military regime. Somaliland's case was different. Somalia had a recognized transitional government. However weak, the O couldn't undermine even a non-functional member state's territorial integrity. Ethiopia's position was complex. They had de facto relations with Somaliland. Ethiopian airlines flew to Hargeisa. Trade crossed the border. Security cooperation existed. But Ethiopia wouldn't formally recognize Somaliland without O approval. As an O powerhouse, Ethiopia could have pushed for recognition, but chose not to, balancing regional relationships against potentially destabilizing precedent. Kenya maintained similar ambivalence. Kenya had its own secessionist concerns in its northern regions. Recognizing Somaliland might encourage these movements. But Kenya also valued Somaliland's stability, which prevented refugee flows and provided a counter to al-Shabaab. Kenya engaged pragmatically while maintaining official non-recognition. The United States, United Kingdom, and European Union followed the AU's lead. They provided assistance to Somaliland through NGOs and development programs. They praised Somaliland's democracy, but they wouldn't recognize it without African approval. The West's influence in Africa had declined since decolonization. They wouldn't impose recognition against African wishes. Arab states maintained complicated positions. The UAE invested in Berbera port, effectively acknowledging Somaliland's existence. Saudi Arabia received Somaliland's livestock exports, but these Gulf monarchies maintained official relations with Somalia's government and wouldn't recognize Somaliland. Economic pragmatism coexisted with diplomatic conservatism. Taiwan itself existing in recognition limbo. Established relations with Somaliland in 2020. They shared the experience of functioning statehood without widespread recognition. But Taiwan's involvement was controversial. China, which claims Taiwan, pressured Somaliland. Some wondered if associating with Taiwan would hurt Somaliland's recognition prospects. The passport issue symbolized Somaliland's predicament. Somaliland issued passports, but few countries accepted them. Somalilanders traveling internationally often had to obtain Somali passports, effectively denying their Somaliland identity. The diaspora navigated this through complicated legal arrangements, but it was a constant reminder of non-recognition's practical consequences. International investment was severely limited. Without recognition, international banks couldn't operate in Somaliland. Foreign companies faced legal complications investing in a territory that officially didn't exist. Contracts were enforceable, but under which jurisdiction insurance was difficult. Every international transaction required creative workarounds. Education was limited by non-recognition. Somaliland universities couldn't be internationally accredited. Degrees weren't automatically recognized abroad. Students who wanted international careers had to pursue education elsewhere. Brain drain was constant as educated Somalilanders sought opportunities in recognized nations. Healthcare suffered similarly. International medical organizations couldn't operate officially in Somaliland. Pharmaceutical companies had difficulty importing medicines. Medical equipment required special arrangements. During health crises, Somaliland couldn't directly access international health systems. They had to route requests through Somalia's government, which often didn't cooperate. Sports were another victim. Somaliland's football team couldn't join FIFA. Athletes competed under Somalia's flag or not at all. This was particularly painful for young people who saw sports as path to international recognition and opportunity. Somaliland organized its own leagues but couldn't participate in international competitions. Yet, Somaliland persisted. Each year, without recognition, could have been the year they gave up. They could have tried to negotiate reunion with Somalia under federal terms. They could have descended into the chaos affecting the South. They could have become another failed state. They did none of these things. They simply continued governing, holding elections, and building institutions. The cost of non-recognition was measured in lost opportunities. Development that could have happened didn't. Jobs that could have been created weren't. Education that could have reached international standards didn't. Healthcare that could have saved lives couldn't access resources. Every year without recognition was a year of foregone progress. But recognition itself became less important to many Somalilanders than the reality they had built. They had peace while the South had war. They had democracy while the South had warlords. They had functioning institutions while the South had chaos. Recognition would be welcome, but it wasn't necessary for their identity or their sense of accomplishment. The question shifted from will Somaliland be recognized to how long can Somaliland function without recognition? The answer, after 3 decades, was indefinitely. They had proved that a determined population could build a state from nothing, maintain it without international support, and succeed despite being officially invisible. That achievement, whether the world recognized it or not, was remarkable. The Red Sea was becoming increasingly important in global geopolitics. The Suez Canal carried a huge portion of world trade. Oil from the Gulf flowed through these waters. China's Belt and Road Initiative sought influence in ports along the route. Regional powers, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, Turkey, competed for position. The Horn of Africa, overlooking this strategic waterway, couldn't be ignored. Berbera Port, Somaliland's main maritime facility, suddenly looked attractive to international investors. The port was well positioned, underutilized, and in a stable environment in the region. The UAE's DP World signed a deal in 2016 to develop and operate Berbera, investing hundreds of millions of dollars. Ethiopia, seeking port access after losing Eritrea, invested in the project and planned a trade corridor to Berbera. This investment was a breakthrough. A major international corporation was treating Somaliland as a legitimate partner. The UAE and Ethiopia were effectively acknowledging Somaliland's authority over its territory. Somalia's government protested, claiming jurisdiction over Berbera, but nobody listened. Economic reality was overwhelming diplomatic fiction. The military dimension added another layer. The UAE was fighting in Yemen, across the Gulf of Aden from Somaliland. They needed a military base for logistics. Berbera was perfect. The UAE built a military facility, further entangling international interests with Somaliland's stability. Saudi Arabia also showed interest. Somaliland was becoming strategically valuable. China's interests in the region complicated matters further. China had built a military base in Djibouti, right next to Somaliland. They were investing heavily in Ethiopia. But China also maintained strong relations with Somalia's government and was invested in the Belt and Road Project. Beijing's position on Somaliland was carefully neutral, engage economically but maintain official non-recognition. The anti-piracy campaign brought international naval forces to Somaliland's waters. The international community, fighting Somali pirates operating from Puntland, needed safe harbors and cooperation. Somaliland provided both. International naval ships called at Berbera. Somaliland's Coast Guard worked with international forces. Security cooperation deepened without formal recognition. Al-Shabaab's terrorism in southern Somalia made Somaliland's stability even more valuable. The United States and European nations worried about ungoverned spaces in the Horn of Africa. Somaliland was governed, stable, and opposed to terrorism. Western security agencies cooperated with Somaliland, creating de facto security partnerships. Israel's interest in the region was long-standing, but quiet. Israel sought African allies to counter Arab isolation. Israel needed intelligence assets in a strategically important region. Israel valued working with Muslim nations that weren't hostile. Somaliland fit these criteria. But Israel had never officially engaged. Understanding that open involvement might complicate Somaliland's relations with Arab states. But by the 2020s, regional dynamics were shifting. The Abraham Accords had normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states. Sudan recognized Israel. Arab Gulf states were deepening ties. The old taboos were weakening. Israel was less isolated. Somaliland saw opportunity. Somaliland's government made discreet overtures to Israel. They offered cooperation. They suggested that mutual recognition might benefit both parties. Israel was intrigued. A partner in the Horn of Africa would serve Israeli strategic interests. Recognizing Somaliland would cost little politically. Somalia was hostile to Israel anyway, and might set a precedent, helping Somaliland gain broader recognition. For Somaliland, Israel represented something else, a country willing to break the recognition deadlock. 3 decades of waiting for African approval had yielded nothing. Maybe recognition from outside Africa would create momentum. Maybe other states would follow Israel's lead. Maybe the wall of non-recognition could be cracked. The negotiations were secret. Neither side wanted premature disclosure to derail the process. Israeli diplomats visited Hargeisa quietly. Somaliland representatives went to Israel. They discussed cooperation on agriculture, technology, security, and trade. But the real prize was recognition. Both sides wanted it. The question was timing and framing. The decision required careful geopolitical calculation. How would Ethiopia react? They had security cooperation with both Israel and Somaliland. Would Israeli recognition alienate Ethiopia? Arab Gulf states were Israel's new partners, but they also had economic interests in Somaliland. Would recognition strain these relationships? Somalia would certainly protest, but Somalia's protests were increasingly irrelevant. The regional context seemed favorable. The Abraham Accords had changed regional dynamics. Israel's normalization with Arab states had reduced the cost of engaging with Israel. Somaliland's 3 decades of stability and democracy had built credibility. International sympathy existed, even if it hadn't translated into recognition. The moment seemed right. In early 2025, the announcement came. Israel formally recognized the Republic of Somaliland as an independent state. Diplomatic relations would be established, embassies would open, trade agreements would follow, technical cooperation would expand. Somaliland, after 3 decades in diplomatic limbo, had achieved recognition from a state with significant international standing. The reaction was immediate and mixed. Somaliland erupted in celebration. Finally, recognition. Finally, validation. 3 decades of patient state-building had paid off. The diaspora celebrated globally. In Hargeisa, spontaneous demonstrations filled streets. Flags waved. Poets composed verses about the historic moment. Somalia's government, in Mogadishu, condemned the decision. They called it interference in Somalia's internal affairs. They demanded Israel reverse the recognition. They appealed to the O and Arab League, but their protests lacked force. Somalia barely controlled Mogadishu, let alone Somaliland. Their claim to sovereignty over Somaliland was purely theoretical. African responses varied. Ethiopia issued a carefully neutral statement, noting they valued relations with both Israel and Somaliland. Kenya remained silent. South Africa, traditionally pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel, condemned the move. The O held an emergency meeting, but couldn't agree on a response. Some members saw an opportunity to finally address Somaliland's unique situation. Others feared a dangerous precedent. Arab states' reactions were telling. The UAE and Bahrain, having normalized with Israel, said little. Saudi Arabia issued a mild statement supporting Somalia's territorial integrity, but took no action. Egypt protested more strongly, worried about Nile water issues and regional balances, but none took concrete steps against Somaliland or Israel. The United States cautiously welcomed Israel's decision, while refraining from following suit. The State Department noted Somaliland's stability and democratic governance, but said recognition required careful consideration. Europe followed similar lines, positive statements, but no immediate action. The West wanted to see how the situation developed before committing. The precedent question dominated analysis. Would Israeli recognition lead to a cascade? Would other nations follow? Or would Somaliland remain recognized by Israel but few others, in a new category of partial recognition? The coming months would answer these questions. But one thing was certain: the three-decade status quo was broken. Somaliland was no longer entirely invisible. The wall had cracked. The news of Israel's recognition spread across the Horn of Africa like wildfire. In Hargeisa, the celebrations continued for days. Businesses closed as people took to the streets. Musicians improvised songs about the historic moment. Elders gathered to discuss what this meant. Young people, who had never known anything but non-recognition, tried to comprehend that their country was finally visible to part of the world. But celebrations were mixed with uncertainty. What would Israel's recognition actually change? Somaliland still wasn't in the United Nations. The African Union still didn't recognize them. Most nations still maintained their position. One country's recognition was significant, symbolically, but practically, Somaliland's status remained complicated. The immediate practical changes were tangible. Israeli and Somaliland diplomats would establish embassies. This meant Somalilanders could obtain Israeli visas directly, opening travel opportunities. Israeli companies could invest officially rather than through complicated arrangements. Technical cooperation in agriculture, water management, and technology would expand. These weren't trivial benefits. Israel's recognition also provided a template. If Somaliland could establish full diplomatic relations with one nation, they could do so with others. The argument that recognition was impossible was refuted. Somaliland's representatives began reaching out to other nations more confidently. Maybe Israel's move would give others courage to follow. But recognition also brought complications. Somalia's government, while weak, still had diplomatic relations globally. They pressured other nations to refuse recognition of Somaliland. They argued that Israel's move was politically motivated, Israel wanting an African ally rather than genuine support for Somaliland's case. Some nations found this argument persuasive. The Arab League convened a meeting. Somalia was a member. Somaliland wasn't. The League issued a statement rejecting Israel's recognition and supporting Somalia's territorial integrity. But the statement had little practical effect. Arab nations had diverse interests. Gulf states, with investments in Somaliland, quietly continued engagement regardless of official statements. Al-Shabaab issued threats against Somaliland, calling cooperation with Israel apostasy. They warned of attacks. Somaliland's security forces increased vigilance. The threat was real. Al-Shabaab had struck Somaliland before, but Somaliland's counter-terrorism capabilities were strong. The population rallied around their government, determined not to let terrorism derail their progress. Ethiopia's response was crucial. Ethiopia had deep relations with both Israel and Somaliland. They used Berbera port. They had security cooperation with both. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed issued a statement, carefully balanced. Ethiopia respected all parties, supported regional stability, and encouraged dialogue. It was diplomatic language, meaning Ethiopia would continue working with Somaliland, regardless of recognition debates. Kenya watched nervously. They had their own secessionist concerns in the north. where ethnic Somalis sometimes sought to join Somalia. Israeli recognition of Somaliland might encourage these movements. But Kenya also valued Somaliland's stability and cooperation against al-Shabaab. Kenya's position remained officially neutral, but practically supportive. The United Kingdom, Somaliland's former colonizer, faced pressure to follow Israel's lead. British MPs, who had long supported Somaliland recognition, renewed their calls. The Foreign Office resisted, citing positions and concerns about setting precedents. But British engagement with Somaliland deepened, approaching de facto recognition, even without formal acknowledgement. Taiwan's recognition of Somaliland in 2020 had been controversial because of China's opposition. Now Israel's recognition provided some cover. 2 states recognized Somaliland. It wasn't just Taiwan, isolated by China. A pattern was emerging. Maybe other states would join, creating a critical mass that would force broader recognition. Legal scholars debated Somaliland's case with renewed intensity. The Montevideo Convention on Statehood lists for criteria: permanent population, defined territory, government, and capacity to enter into relations. Somaliland clearly met all 4. Recognition isn't technically required for statehood, declaratory, not constitutive, but practically, recognition matters enormously for international functionality. The precedent argument weakened under scrutiny. Every secessionist case is unique. Somaliland's colonial history, voluntary union, complete state collapse in Somalia, and 3 decades of stable governance created circumstances that wouldn't apply to, say, Catalonia or Scotland. Recognizing Somaliland needn't create a universal right to secession. Economic developments accelerated. Israeli investment increased in technology, agriculture, and renewable energy. Somaliland had abundant solar and wind resources, but lacked capital and expertise. Israeli companies brought both. Desalination projects, crucial for Somaliland's water security, benefited from Israeli expertise. Economic cooperation created constituencies for continued engagement. Educational exchanges began. Somaliland students won scholarships to Israeli universities. Somaliland professionals attended training programs in Israel. Israeli academics visited Somaliland institutions. These people-to-people connections built relationships deeper than diplomatic statements. Understanding grew between societies that knew little of each other. Security cooperation expanded. Israel shared counterterrorism expertise. Somaliland's security forces received training. Intelligence sharing helped both parties. For Israel, having a partner in the Horn of Africa provided strategic depth. For Somaliland, Israeli security assistance enhanced capabilities against real threats. But the larger question remained: would others follow? Western democracies expressed sympathy but hadn't recognized. African nations, with rare exceptions, followed the line. Arab nations balanced multiple interests. China and Russia maintained official positions supporting Somalia's integrity. India, focused on its own interests, stayed neutral. The breakthrough, if it came, would likely come from smaller nations, less concerned about precedents. European nations like Denmark or the Netherlands, with interests in Red Sea stability, might recognize. Latin American nations, geographically distant, might feel free to acknowledge reality. Pacific Island nations, themselves small and understanding recognition struggles, might sympathize. Or recognition might remain partial indefinitely. Kosovo was recognized by many Western nations, but not by Russia, China, or much of the developing world. Taiwan was recognized by a handful of small states, but not by most nations. Somaliland might join this category, existing clearly, functioning effectively, but perpetually in recognition limbo. What Israeli recognition had accomplished, regardless of who followed, was psychological. For 30 years, Somaliland existed but was invisible. Now they were seen, at least partially. Their patience had been rewarded, even if incompletely. The message to Somalilanders was clear: keep building, keep governing, keep proving your case. Recognition, full recognition, might come gradually rather than suddenly, but it would come. The sun rises over Hargeisa, painting the rebuilt city in golden light. The ruins that dominated the landscape in 1991 are mostly gone now, replaced by new buildings, bustling markets, and streets filled with people going about their lives. It's a city that died and came back to life through sheer determination. It's a city that refuses to be a victim of history. In a small cafe, old men sip tea and discuss the news. Israel's recognition is still the topic. Weeks after the announcement, some see it as final vindication. Others worry about complications, but all agree on one thing: Somaliland has survived. Against all odds, despite all obstacles, they built something worth defending. Walk through any Somaliland town and you see the weight of history in everyday moments. A woman who survived the 1988 bombardment now runs a business employing 30 people. A man who fled as a refugee now teaches at the university. Children who were born after independence play in streets where their parents once feared for their lives. This is what reconstruction looks like, not dramatic, just determined. The colonial legacy lives in strange ways. British legal concepts, mixed with Italian administrative terms, mixed with Somali customary practices, create a unique hybrid. The language of government is Somali, but English and Arabic are widely spoken. The culture is entirely Somali, but the political institutions show their colonial DNA. History doesn't disappear, it transforms. The border between Somaliland and Somalia is quiet today. No fighting, no refugees flowing across, just a line on a map that once meant nothing and now means everything. On one side, stability and hope. On the other, continuing struggle. The difference isn't inherent in the people, they're the same people. The difference is in choices made decades ago and reinforced daily since. In Mogadishu, Somalia's transitional government still claims Somaliland. Maps in government offices show a unified Somalia. Officials make speeches about national unity, but it's theater. Nobody in Mogadishu has controlled Hargeisa since 1991. The claim is legal fiction maintained because admitting reality would mean acknowledging failure. Somalia's story is Somaliland's story, to the same colonial division, the same hasty union, the same disastrous dictatorship. But from 1991, the stories diverged. Somalia descended into warlordism, foreign intervention, Islamic extremism, and endless conflict. Somaliland chose peace, traditional reconciliation, democratic experimentation, and patient state-building. Why such different paths from the same starting point? Part of the answer is trauma. The Isaaq genocide was so horrific that it created determination to never repeat the experience. Southern Somalia had violence too, but not the focused ethnic extermination the North experienced. That trauma, paradoxically, became a source of unity. Everyone in Somaliland remembers what happens when order collapses and clan hatred goes unchecked. Part is the British colonial legacy. specifically its lightness. British Somaliland was never heavily colonized. Traditional structures weren't completely destroyed. When independence came, Somalilanders could revive the Gurdi system and other traditional governance. Italian colonialism in the south had been more intrusive, creating deeper disruption. Building from ruins is easier when you remember what existed before. Part is leaders who chose reconciliation over revenge. After 1991, Somaliland could have conducted ethnic cleansing against clans that had supported Barre. They didn't. They chose to include everyone, negotiate power sharing, and build forward. Leaders emerged who valued peace more than power. This wasn't inevitably was chosen, and part is simply fortune. Somaliland didn't become a proxy battlefield for foreign powers. International intervention largely bypassed them. They were left alone to solve their own problems. That neglect, while painful economically, gave them space to experiment. Somalia, by contrast, suffered through American intervention, UN peacekeeping, Ethiopian invasions, and regional meddling. Sometimes being ignored is a blessing, but the greatest achievement is intangible. Somaliland proved that Somali self-governance can work. For decades, the assumption was that Somalis were inherently ungovernable, addicted to clan conflict, incapable of modern statehood. Somaliland refuted that racist narrative. Somalis can govern, they can build, they can create stability. The problem wasn't culture, it was circumstance. The question now is, what comes next? Israeli recognition opened a door. Will others walk through? Somaliland has done everything asked of a state seeking recognition. They've built democratic institutions. They've maintained stability. They've controlled their territory. They've held free elections. They've respected human rights more than many recognized African states. What more can they do? Maybe the answer is nothing more. Maybe 3 decades of patience is enough. Maybe the world will continue refusing recognition regardless of merit. Maybe Somaliland will exist indefinitely in this limbo state in all but name, functioning but invisible, successful but unacknowledged. Or maybe Israel's recognition was the crack in the dam. Maybe other nations will follow. Slowly at first, then in a rush. Maybe the African Union will finally acknowledge that Somaliland's case is unique and merits exception. Maybe the principle of colonial borders will bend without breaking. Maybe Somaliland will finally sit in the UN, flag flying alongside nations that pretended they didn't exist for decades. The colonial legacy that carved up Somali territories in the 1880s still shapes reality today. Those lines drawn by men who never visited these lands, who knew nothing of clan territories or cultural boundaries, who cared only for European power politics, those lines persist. Somaliland's borders are the borders of British Somaliland. They're colonial borders, just like all the others Africa considers sacrosanct. The irony is perfect. Somaliland asks for recognition based on the same principle the African Union uses to deny it. Colonial borders are inviolable, says the O. Exactly, says Somaliland, connies our colonial borders. The O says no, that would encourage secession. But Somaliland isn't seceding from a functioning state. It's declining to remain part of a failed state that hasn't functioned in 30+ years. As evening falls, over Hargeisa lights come on across the city. Electricity flows reliably now, a small miracle in this region. Students study for exams. Businesses close for the day. Families gather for meals. Life continues, ordinary and extraordinary, all at once. 34 years ago, this city was rubble. Now it lives. The story of Somaliland is the story of how colonial borders created nations that sometimes worked and sometimes failed catastrophically. It's the story of how arbitrary lines on maps shaped millions of lives. It's the story of how history's weight can crush people or inspire them to build something new from ruins. And it's a story still being written. Israel's recognition is a chapter, perhaps a turning point, perhaps just a footnote. The ending isn't written yet, but the people of Somaliland, who have waited 34 years with patience that borders on the heroic, will continue living, building, hoping. They've survived colonialism, dictatorship, genocide, and 3 decades of invisibility. They'll survive whatever comes next. The sun sets over the Gulf of Aden, painting the horizon in colors that no flag can capture. The light fades slowly, reluctantly, the way history moves gradual, inevitable, toward something we can't yet see clearly. Tomorrow, the sun will rise again over Somaliland, as it has every day since that May morning in 1991, when a people decided their future. Recognition or not, Somaliland endures. That might be the most important lesson of all. We've traveled through more than a century of history tonight, from ancient trade routes to modern recognition struggles. We've witnessed colonial map-making that carved up peoples with no regard for their wishes. We've watched as artificial divisions became real identities. We've seen hope, union, betrayal, genocide, and rebirth. Somaliland's story raises questions that echo across our world today. When do borders matter more than people? When should past decisions be reversed? How do we balance stability with justice? These aren't just Somaliland's questions, they're questions facing dozens of disputed territories globally. If you found this story compelling, I encourage you to learn more. Read about other de facto states existing in recognition limbo. Understand how the international system works, how recognition happens or doesn't happen. See how colonial legacies still shape our world in ways we rarely acknowledge. In our next journey through history, we'll explore another story of borders, identity, and the long shadow of colonialism. We'll look at how the Berlin Conference's decisions in 1884 continue affecting specific regions today. We'll examine how arbitrary lines drawn on maps created conflicts that persist generations later. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The patterns we've explored tonight: colonial division, hasty decolonization, ethnic conflict, state collapse, across Africa and beyond. Understanding one story helps us understand them all. History doesn't repeat exactly, but it rhymes, and the rhythms matter. Until next time, rest well with these thoughts. Borders drawn in distant rooms continue shaping lives today. Nations that don't exist on paper can be more functional than those that do. Recognition and reality aren't always the same thing. And sometimes, the most remarkable achievement is simply refusing to give up when the world refuses to see you. Sleep peacefully, knowing that somewhere tonight, people are building futures despite history's weight. They're proving that determination can overcome neglect, that hope can survive decades of disappointment. Somaliland's story isn't finished, neither is yours. Tomorrow is unwritten. The question is, what we'll make of it? Let the story settle into your mind like dust on ancient trade routes. The caravans that once carried frankincense across these highlands continue their journey in different forms, now carrying dreams of recognition, hopes for justice, memories of what was and visions of what might be. Somaliland's journey is still unfolding. Tomorrow morning, someone in Hargeisa will wake up, drink tea, and go to work building a nation the world half refuses to see. Someone in the diaspora will send money home, sustaining the dream of a homeland that exists in reality but not in international law. Someone in an embassy will continue the patient work of diplomacy, knowing recognition may come next year or never. These are the quiet heroes of unfinished stories, not warriors, not politicians, just people refusing to accept that their country doesn't count. Their patience is its own form of courage. Their hope, sustained through 3 decades of disappointment, is its own kind of revolution. As you drift into sleep, let go of the weight of history we've carried together tonight. The borders, the wars, the genocides, the struggles, they matter, but they aren't everything. What matters more is what people build despite them. What matters is choosing peace when revenge would be easier. What matters is believing in tomorrow when yesterday was so painful. The Horn of Africa sleeps now under the same stars that guided ancient merchants. The Gulf of Aden is quiet. In Mogadishu, in Hargeisa, in the refugee camps scattered across the region, people sleep with dreams of better days. Some dreams are about recognition. Others are simpler, just safety, just food, just another day without war. History doesn't end. It just becomes the present, then memory, then the stories we tell to make sense of why things are the way they are. Tonight, you've heard one such story. Tomorrow, it will seem distant, as if you dreamed it. But somewhere in your mind, you'll remember there's a place that built itself from rubble, that governs itself without permission, that exists despite being invisible. That's the lesson to carry into sleep. Existence doesn't require recognition. Reality is more stubborn than law. And sometimes, the greatest act of resistance is simply continuing to be when the world says you shouldn't exist. Rest now. Let the rhythm of this story carry you into sleep, gentle as monsoon winds, steady as the tide. History continues its long arc. We've witnessed one small bend in that arc tonight. There will be others. There always are. The story of borders and peoples, of colonialism's long shadows, of nations born and dying and being born again. These stories circle through time like prayers. Somaliland is one prayer among many, an answered prayer for some, still waiting for others. Sleep peacefully. Tomorrow, history continues. New borders will be drawn and contested. New nations will emerge or fail to emerge. New peoples will discover that their existence isn't recognized, and they'll face the same choice Somaliland faced: give up or endure. If you learned nothing else tonight, remember this: people endure. Against all logic, all discouragement, all impossibility, people endure. Somaliland proves it. Every morning, someone wakes in Hargeisa to continue building a nation that technically doesn't exist is proof. Existence is more than recognition. Reality is more than law. Drift into dreams. Now, gentle listener, let history dissolve into sleep. Tomorrow, you'll wake in your own borders, your own recognized nation, your own mapped existence. But perhaps you'll remember, just for a moment, those who live in the cracks of the international system existing, building, hoping, enduring. Good night. Let the story fade like the last light over the highlands. Let it become memory. Let it become a dream. Let it become whatever it becomes in that mysterious space between waking and sleeping, where stories live and history breathes and tomorrow waits. The Horn of Africa sleeps. The Gulf of Aden sleeps, Somaliland sleeps, but it dreams. And in the morning, whether recognized or not, it will wake and continue. That's the story. That's always the story. Endurance, hope, tomorrow. Sleep well.